Sonali.
Yes. Can
Yeah.
we communicate via WhatsApp if
Sure.
that's okay?
Hi, Arati.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Great. Okay. Despite being in Stockholm, the Wi-Fi is pretty bad.
Oh, you mean my voice isn't clear?
No. It happens to me sometimes where there's issues on my side. No, you're very clear.
Okay, perfect. And I don't think you have turned on your video yet, right? Do you want to do a
No.
test of that just to see if it's
Yeah,
okay?
sure. I can't seem to turn, wait, down here, okay.
Hi.
I actually am watching someone's screen. I can't actually,
You can't see me?
I can see you, but
Oh,
I
okay.
can't see me.
Oh, I can see you though.
There
Hey,
I am.
Ati,
Got
how
it.
are you?
Hi.
So at exactly 4, I'm going to start talking and then I will hand it over to you, Siddharth, and you can go ahead.
Sounds good to
Sounds
me.
good. I got the questions. They're very, very elaborate, but we're going to freestyle a little bit as well, right?
Yeah,
I
of
hope.
course. I mean, those were just like very indicative of where the conversation could potentially
Exactly.
head. And I may not even get the time to go through all of them. And I think as long as we're generally able to discuss those issues, it's going to be fine. And I'd want it to be like freestyle. I think people
Exactly.
will
Good.
appreciate a conversation as opposed to an interview.
Exactly. And that's the, I mean, for webinars, that makes sense to kind of use the opportunity to have an informal discussion.
Absolutely. And you're based in Stockholm, right?
Based in Stockholm, but work mainly with India and the energy
Got it.
sector, yeah.
Because
But
I saw
started
your
off in India.
name. I saw your name on the list of
Um,
speakers at the.
I think we're live right now, so perhaps we could just,
Okay.
till exactly 4.
Understood. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coronavirus as a Communications Opportunity. I think the session is going to spark a lot of lively debate and leave us with some valuable insights on the COVID narrative and what we can learn from it. On this panel, we have Vinuta Gopal, the CEO of Asar Social Impact, Akshat Rathi, a reporter at Bloomberg, and Aarti Davis, the Executive Director, Sweden, of the India Green Tech Alliance. I'm now going to hand this session over to the moderator, Siddharth, an energy and climate policy expert. Siddharth, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Nargesh. And it's good to have everyone here discussing, I think, what's going to be a pertinent issue of our time. As Nargesh already mentioned, I'm Siddharth Singh, and I'll be your moderator for today. It seems to be strange to be saying this in the midst of a pandemic that has infected over 4 million people and killed 300,000 people worldwide so far. But climate change is still the gravest existential threat to humankind today. We face mass displacement, internal and international climate refugees, large-scale mortalities due to extreme weather events such as droughts and hurricanes, deaths due to air pollution, loss of habitat, and of course, grave economic risks and losses. In fact, many of these things are already playing out today with air pollution that kills 4 million people worldwide every year, year after year after year. Now, climate change and air pollution has been fueled by our energy use since the beginning of the industrialization, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And today, over 75% of CO2 that's added to the atmosphere by humans every year is from the burning of fossil fuels. This amounts to about 30 gigatons of CO2 emissions year after year, and this accumulates. It's not something that gets reset every year. In fact, I've done a quick back of the envelope calculation. If this panel was meeting physically in Delhi, so this would mean Arati flying in from Stockholm and Akshat from London, we would have seen perhaps transport-led emissions of over 1.5 tons of CO2. So that's significant. Therefore, I think one of the key pillars of climate action today is through clean energy transitions. That is, transitions from fossil fuels to low or no emission technologies in transport, industry, cooking, generating electricity, you name it. We have to find ways to ensure we scale up these clean energy technologies rapidly, and we have to find the political and public support for it. This is where communications comes in. So now, even as scientists and activists in the climate and energy world have been trying to raise awareness for the need for climate action and energy transitions, the COVID-19 pandemic has basically swept through and captured the attention of billions of people. This is something that the climate and energy community has been dreaming of for ages, because after all, the threat is serious and it requires swift action and, more importantly, public support. So we would like to basically understand today, what is it that we can learn from this pandemic that could make climate and energy communications more effective over time? To understand this, we have, of course, three very knowledgeable guests, Vinuta Gopal, Arati Davis, and Akshat Rathi. And I think it's time I stop speaking and get everyone in. So I'd like to start with Vinuta, with her thoughts on, in quotes, nature taking spaces back. So I'd like to ask you, we have seen air quality improve very rapidly in northern India, for example. We have heard stories of people being able to hear birds chirp and marine creatures close to the coastlines. So the question is that, on the one hand, it does help people visualize an alternative reality and what we should be pursuing. But at the same time, does it send the wrong message that environmental issues are quick and easy to solve, or restricting human activities is the only way to do it? So over to you, Vinuta.
Thank you, Sanjay. So I think what the last months have clearly shown is that, one, of course, the resilience of nature. So when nature is given space, then the strength of nature to come back. We have clean rivers, we have cleaner lakes, we have clean air, and as you said, people are suddenly seeing and feeling all of this. If you're a youngster, almost for the first time, so there is an immense possibility that opens up, because Otherwise, you sort of accepted the fact that maybe this is not really possible, and what people are talking about, this more beautiful environment, is not a reality. But at this point in time, we can actually viscerally feel, see, smell what this feels like, right? And that clearly would change imaginations. At the same time, I think the point you made about, does it take a lockdown for this to happen? And therefore, is it even possible if we are not in this sort of horrible situation where a lot of people are struggling? I think that is also a really important thing, that we must ensure that we communicate the fact that this is possible without these kind of without these hardships. However, it is possible only if you take very, very dramatic action. I don't think that we should try and soften in any way. It's true that for us to be able to have this kind of change, we need to take drastic steps. The incremental steps, for example, Delhi doing odd even, is simply not going to clean the air. So I think that has also been brought home.
I think that's a very interesting point, especially about dramatic action, which is what in a way we have seen today. But this has also come at the cost of the displacement of migrant workers and rising unemployment. Now, with clean energy transitions, there has been this risk has also kind of worried people in, for example, the coal mining industry and other industries that may lose out. So I'd like to bring in Akshat Rathi here, and I'd like to hear his views on both the nature of the lockdown and the improvements that we have temporarily seen, and how we can communicate to those people who risk or feel that they will lose out due to such a transition.
I think that's a very good point, Siddharth. One thing we should note is that the policy changes that have been brought in face of trying to deal with a pandemic are severe, but also very fast. We've seen them come through, with very little warning, and that has meant, negative impact for migrant workers, for example, in India. But that has been the case across the world for different communities. In some way, climate action that way is simpler because the policy changes that you need to make may seem big and drastic, but they play out over a long time. Years to decades is what we are looking at if we are going to cut emissions in line with what the science asks us to do. And so, I really agree with Manuta that it gives us a flavor of what the world could be if those policy changes are put in place and they play out over a long period. But I think you're right in that we have to realize that any of these policies will have impact. We are doing this to save lives, but they will also have negative impact on other people's lives. So migrant workers right now are struggling in the same way during the transition that we are going to observe. There are livelihoods that will have been affected because of those policies. You brought up coal miners. Currently, one of the biggest clusters of coronavirus cases in Poland are tied to coal miners. People who've worked in coal mines have weaker lungs because they are breathing in the particulate matter directly as part of the mining activity, even with modern safety equipment given to them. And these kinds of vulnerabilities are something we should definitely be keeping in mind with all the policies that we are going to have to implement to try and tackle climate change.
And Rathi, what are your thoughts on this?
I actually think, these are really important points that are being brought up, and what comes to mind given COVID and climate is that for so long, all of us working in the climate space and clean energy transitions and looking at what we can do have been battling the north-south divide. We've been shadowboxing along those borders and those delineations. And what COVID has done is actually show us what global partnership can look like. It affects all of us. I think, Akshat, you're really, what you put together in terms of the lines that get drawn, despite which geographies we talk about, they're the same. And the vulnerable people, the vulnerable income earners, they're the same across geographies. And what COVID has shown us is that we can't look at it with boundaries and national borders anymore. It goes much beyond that. And that gives us a lot of opportunity when it comes to clean energy transition. But also, Siddharth, you mentioned the existential dilemma. Interesting, because of course, COVID has been so impactful because it's short-term and it affects us. We can talk about community, but our livelihood and our impact is seen to be what's at play to trigger our actions and our change in actions. So that's something we have to take away with us and say, how do we create that urgency in a climate debate where impact for people on this panel might not be felt the next 5-10 years. But as you also said, it's happening today, but in arenas that we are not perhaps face to face.
Okay, I think, yeah, perfect. So I think this is an interesting leeway, because I'd like to also quickly take your views on, how we got to a point where there was urgent and global action on this pandemic front. This kind of action has never been seen before, and this kind of coordination has also never been seen before. So what is it about this particular pandemic that organizations such as the WHO or governments got right in terms of communication? And what did we get wrong? What are the places where perhaps misinformation is flowing out of? I'd like to understand from you basically what the key takeaway would be if we were to apply these communication strategies in our world of climate and energy transitions. So Vinuta, would you like to step in here?
So I think, of course, it's the pandemic that's happened in a digital time, when even in India, the telecom revolution has allowed WhatsApp messages to reach faster than other forms of communication. So I think there's a possible overload of communication in terms of what people are receiving, and so sifting through what's real, what's true, what's false, all of that's a new challenge versus getting the message out. So it's also trying to curb and stall messages from flowing that's causing panic, and that's not helpful. I also want to say that I think in terms of urgency and what climate campaigners have struggled for a long time to make the issue urgent, is the personal. It's the personal in this situation, right? Like it was said, this is about what's going to happen to us. It's about life and death, and it's about fear. And in many ways, one has struggled with trying to convince people about the urgency and the need to act on climate, because it's not personal, it's not simple, it's not one virus that needs to be defeated. And I think that challenge continues to be a challenge. One hopes that the pandemic has brought to people and governments and policymakers the reality of what a crisis, a global crisis, can look like. And what the solutions are as well, in terms of collaboration and the extent to which public behavior can change almost overnight. In India, I see everyone wearing masks today. And so, we've seen massive public behavior changes. So I think it opens up both possibilities and the challenge of communication in a digital age, which is both good and challenging.
Can I jump in, Siddharth? I actually have a question for Vinuta, because it really raises, when we were discussing this in the preparation and we were thinking about these ideas, you touched upon it exactly. There's too much information. And it's very difficult to kind of sift through where we should be looking and how not to get overwhelmed and confused. But should we not be, as citizens and as community members, looking to information in our network and our infrastructure to see how do we take care of ourselves and our community and limit our information, not limit, but focus on what information is coming out there, and not broaden it beyond a certain element where we create resilience within the local schemes?
Mm-hmm. So I think it certainly has brought up the importance of networks and communities, because if we did have a community on which to sort of base our trust on. And we did trust, the messages that came from that group of people, and that could be, even groups that are reaching the NGOs or government who's reaching out to migrant workers, creating those communication channels. So I think a lot of networks have been built now over these last months, and I think will continue to strengthen over the period of this pandemic. And those networks are going to become extremely critical for building resilient communities and to ensure more trusted networks of information. I guess that's something we hopefully build on, because it is getting built as we speak.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and say, I think trust is such a key important factor currently. And, I'll bring in two biases. I'm a journalist, and I also did a PhD in chemistry, so I'm a scientist. But both those biases sort of are quite important on what's happening right now. I think, supporting journalism, fact-based journalism, is absolutely key. One of the things that within weeks of the pandemic becoming a global issue, this is going back in January, was I put out messages on all the WhatsApp groups I was, that if you have any science questions, please ask me. I'm here to help. I'm happy to check through any articles that you're going to forward to other people, or forwards you're getting from other people, because WhatsApp, which is clearly the biggest channel of communication in India, is rife with misinformation. And having journalists, and it doesn't have to be just journalists, but journalists are paid to do this, put out the facts in the right order, is critically important. I think the other aspect which I found has been a success partially in the pandemic is science communication. The phrases like flatten the curve have become widely understood and acknowledged because the impact of flattening the curve is direct. You save lives, you save your own life, and you save the lives of your loved ones. And yet, there has been miscommunication in the science too. It's nice to see the use of masks in India. That's not been the case here in the UK, for example. A rich Western country where a science-informed country which has done a lot on climate change, but there is clearly misinformation or lack of understanding on masks, and that's not just because of misinformation that's circulating between people, but also poor communication from the government. They've not put out really clear guidelines, and I think in going through the policies that we will have to implement in climate change, clear communication really becomes very important, and I hope we can take lessons from this.
I think, Akshat, that's a very interesting point, and which brings me to the question of the North-South divide in terms of communicating itself. Like before this pandemic happened, the assumption would have been that the global North, so to speak, would have had a better communication strategy, that they'd be more consistent on the line that people should be taking. On the other hand, we may have seen it's the opposite, wherein many of the rich countries have not been able to communicate, and other countries, perhaps even India, has done a perhaps better job by including messages at the beginning of phone calls and many other steps which have probably led to lesser misinformation, at least from the official channels. So why do you think that is?
It's hard to pin down, and I'm sure one of the things that we will do a lot after the pandemic is study this period and recognize just what went wrong. I think one thing that I can point to is in the West in general is there is a little bit of arrogance in that we are a rich Western country. We know how to handle difficult things that will come our way. And I think there is lack of appreciation that things like a pandemic, but also natural disasters, climate related specifically, aren't things that we as a species have learned to deal with. And I think this is going to humble a lot of people in the world to recognize that there is a lot that we need to still do in making sure our communication and our policies are in place to actually deal with the problem of the scale that we are dealing with now and will face in the future.
I just want to jump in and say, sitting in Stockholm, I can completely agree to that. We are as strong as our last crisis. And a lot of us sitting in the West, as we call it, have not experienced crisis like this before. This will teach us, and we will learn a lot from here as we move forward. Now, India and the global South, they have gone through crisis before. There is a mechanism by which to appreciate and respect information as it comes in to protect yourself. We're learning, and we're on the back foot maybe, but of course, everyone's taken their own strategies to develop communication around this. And when it comes to Sweden, for example, it's a complete outlier in how COVID is being handled, but has not necessarily boomeranged in our face. And that, of course, is culturally specific to what the context is here. And that's not globally replicable. And we work with what we know here and who we know here. And that's true of every country and should be true for every country.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I would say that in a climate context, I think there's something to be learned here, certainly for the Souths to actually say that, we can probably show the way. Multiple Southeast Asian countries have actually handled the crises. India's, at least in terms of the numbers so far, hasn't done so badly. Of course, in terms of the health implications, the migrant crisis and the humanitarian crisis unfolding, we really have to do much better on. But that also tells us that, going back to what Akshat said, that we have time when, in terms of being prepared for the transitions, if we realize from this crisis that we have to be prepared, that disaster preparedness is something that we really need to focus on. And if we take that away as a learning, and if we start institutionalizing that, and if we use the networks that we build, both institutional, the ASHA workers, for example, in India, are doing a phenomenal job in contact tracing and communication of the issue to people. So I think communication is happening at so many different levels at this point in time that there's a lot to learn in terms of how we're going to build resilience for the climate emergencies ahead.
I think that's a very interesting point. And, just to highlight what Arati had previously said about how experience has played a role in our reaction to the current crisis. And from India's example, where states like Kerala, which have had to deal with the previous Nipah outbreaks, had, quicker response times, and therefore they were perhaps able to flatten the curve ahead of, other parts of the country. Now, moving into this debate about climate change and how climate change communication have changed, we, especially in the global South, have experienced climate disasters, and we continue to do so. And this is something that will perhaps intensify as the years go by. The question then is, why is there no constituency for climate action in our parts of the world? Despite having very impressive climate movements over the past many years, we see that it is not an electoral issue till date, and there's no sense of urgency on climate action, either politically or otherwise. So what can be done to change this? What is it about climate communications that, despite these successes, we have not really been able to push the needle on public opinion in a very material way, in the way we engage with our democracy?
But it is on the electoral agenda. It's water, it's agriculture, it's healthcare. These are issues that are already there, but we are packaging them differently. And the nomenclature around climate has been part of our confusion. We've all been working in the space for decades now, and the numbers have changed, the names have changed, but the issues remain. And what this also causes is confusion in funding. As someone who's worked with international funding in this area, the new names have new funding lines, and that needs to change. We need to try and have multi-stakeholder, non-in-silo preferential treatment for these issues. So the question is a great question because it shows the problem that we have. Every issue around climate is an electoral agenda, but it's not climate.
Yeah, and I would add one of the reasons why climate action, and not just in India, globally has stayed back, is the lack of being able to connect it to what matters to people now. So elections are and policies are made in response to what people want now. And one failure of climate communication globally has been connecting what is climate change, a decadal long catastrophe playing out with what will be the catastrophe tomorrow. And I think if we can do that with what's happening right now, I mean, we know that air pollution makes people more vulnerable to the virus because they have weaker lungs, they have weaker immune systems. And we also know that air pollution, the solutions to air pollution will also help us cut carbon emissions, not just the pollution that affects our lungs. And those things, if we can connect them and connect them stronger, we come out much better place to be able to deal with climate change.
Vinuta, we'd like to hear from you, especially because you've been on the campaign front yourself, having headed Greenpeace India in the past. Was there these issues among the people you engage with, especially in the government?
I think Aarti is right. I think, it's not climate, but it's agriculture, it's water, it's air, it's security, it's economic losses for the future, stranded assets, non-performing assets. So I think the challenge really is how do we communicate climate, but personalize it in the way that's right for the right audience, and that's been I think quite difficult. But I think climate communication has gone through phases in terms of the global negotiations on climate for a long time were very important. But I think now and the problem with negotiations is that it's a lot of acronyms, things people don't understand at all. It's very far away. And climate campaigners, I think, made a mistake in trying to prioritize what decision came out of these global negotiations. Not to belittle the negotiations in any way, they're very important, but they were not a message for the public. And I think the real message for the public is how it really matters to them, and that's health. That's the future of my children. It's what's going to happen to the money in the bank. Am my savings suddenly going to disappear because the bank is investing in the wrong kind of infrastructure? So it's those kind of questions, and I think that's really what the pandemics also sort of brought home to us, that public health is now top of agenda, which it wasn't certainly in India and possibly in many other countries. And we've seen clearly countries or even Kerala, which invested in public health infrastructure, is doing much better. So if I think how we make the message personal is to talk about the other things that climate really is. But I think at the same time, preparedness and security and resilience are all things that now, because of the pandemic, have traction. And we need to communicate in those terms.
And injecting a few numbers here, because one of the things that we should recognize is even in the worst case scenario, in the US, for example, 2.2 million people would have died. We don't know what the worst case scenario numbers would have looked at in India, but if we just multiply the population of the US to India, that's 3 or 4 multiplication, you're looking at deaths of 6 million people in India or 8 million people in India. That number through a pandemic is actually comparable to people who die of air pollution in India, both indoor and outdoor air pollution every year. And so in the same metric, we have never done what we have done today to try and save lives. And I think that message needs to be communicated to people, that we are doing this not just to save lives in India, we are also doing this to save lives abroad. Because if one country does not control the pandemic will be with us forever. And so this sort of global coordination plus saving lives right now and what we can do to save lives is a lesson that we should carry forward.
I just want to actually come on looking at numbers. What's so ironic, and when you look at India, is that now we work a lot in the mobility space in clean energy transitions and electromobility, et cetera, and road safety. And road safety deaths have come down now because people are not driving, people are not on the roads. And these are hundreds upon hundreds that are now being taken off the register because there is no mobility happening. And the question is, what happens with COVID plus moving out of lockdown? Do the numbers, escalate? It's nice to have a speculative discussion here because we're not out of lockdown yet. And we don't know what it will look like in this new normal that we all talk about. But all these different forces will come together, and then we see, what are we really dealing with here? And how do we move forward with this collective concern that we now have?
I think this conversation took a very interesting turn, and I completely agree. And I see your point, Arathi, about how climate issues are already political issues, in that, and they take the form of water, farm, and so on and so forth. The question then is that does the public opinion really even matter on issues, on larger environmental issues, as long as we're able to get action on that front? As an example, while there's been no public debate on carbon taxes in India, the fact is that our petrol and diesel is already quite highly taxed, and it's a de facto carbon tax of sorts. We see that energy efficiency gains are already being made, which is reducing emissions in industries through the PAT scheme, which is it's not an emissions trading scheme, it's an energy efficiency trading scheme. But the same kind of public debates that took place in the United States and other countries and led to the politicization of the issue, and therefore perhaps less than desired action, those kind of things are happening in India without the public debate. So do we even need a public debate on these issues?
I think it's a good point to bring up. We should recognize that we are not a fossil fuel country. Yes, we have coal, and we probably have one company that is the largest producer of coal. But apart from that, we don't have oil and gas reserves. And one of the things that has polluted and politicized this issue in the West is money from fossil fuel companies, especially in the 90s. Some have turned around since, but 80s and 90s were a period of massive disinformation campaigns put out in the West. We never saw that in India. And we may be fortunate in some way that the coal company is a government-owned coal company, and has been mostly for a very long time. Doesn't seem like it will change. And so that, I think, is probably the reason we are not seeing the politicization. I don't think that everything needs to be connected to the climate, but I think we should try and make that connection whenever possible, because we can't debate with physics and chemistry, and it is one that we should recognize. If a reality is a reality, it is better to appreciate that that reality exists, rather than letting the policies happen without accepting that reality.
But I think government, there's a lot of burden of proof that you put on government with that question. And we are more than the sum of our parts, in that we have to have industry on board. We have to have academia on board. We have to have all stakeholders sharing the debate. And I think what we've seen in many of the discussions on clean energy transition in India is that the government is listening, but you have to put it on their radar. How do you get it on their radar? You have to bring these forces, a coalition of the willing. And industry is changing, I would say, especially when it comes to mobility solutions. But it will take time because vested interests are there to stay. I think what COVID has done, because of the change in energy demand and the drop in energy demand, and how utilities are really suffering to get the price of energy met, is that we're looking at power sector reform. That has to happen. We cannot continue business as usual on the India scenario anymore. And power sector reform means bring more private sector players on board. Let's make this a discussion on efficiency, and not protect the interests that are there already.
I think maybe just one thing to add is that it's also shown us that political will is really key. So when you have political will, a lot of other things that appear to be barriers earlier just suddenly disappear. And so I think what we need for the kind of climate action we really need is significant political will, and that doesn't happen without public debate and discourse. So I think there are no easy ways for the political shift without public debate.
So I'd like to understand now from the panelists, and you've all had very different experiences engaging with different sets of stakeholders. What, from your own experiences, have been the biggest institutional or structural barriers towards the that basically prevents the flowing of information, or people who may understand it's a reality but are unwilling to act on it or speak about it because because there are some structural reasons because of which they're unable to do so. So what is it that is preventing us from reaching a stage where science communications, it becomes easier, where misinformation stops flowing? These could be on the lines of like social media, it could be institutions which don't publish certain types of data. But what is it from your own experiences that are the biggest barriers? Would you like to start, Akshat?
Yeah, one thing this is as a journalist being inside a newsroom that I don't think people may recognize is in the period between end of February and middle of April, there was a surge in interest from readers about coronavirus. And we could see the number of people coming to news websites. This is across the board, all publications in the world. The number of people wanting to read doubled in that period. And so when there is an unknown and that unknown has an impact on your life, people want to know what's happening. I think if one of the things that we can do with climate communication is make that connection very clear every time, that the policies that may sound a little bit boring, might play out over a little bit of time, will have direct impact on your life, and in what specific way, that is probably going to make it a more effective strategy.
So just before I bring Arathi and Vinuta in on the same question, just a message to everyone who's listening in. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A box or the comment section, and we'll try to go through as many as we possibly can. Over to you, Arathi.
No, I mean, I work in the intersection between business, government, and academia. And so in response to your question, a meeting that we held comes to mind where we had big industry sitting with us, and of course talking about what we can do both in the Sweden-India corridor, so big industry in India as well. And of course, Agenda 2030 is the roadmap that we're all on right now. And we were talking with a very strong broad sector engagement, and we got told very clearly that should is not a market strategy. What we should do is not going to move the needle one single bit. You need to create an understanding and incentive as to why we should do this. And I think what we took away from that, and has been kind of our communication strategies since, is that assumptions should not be made in this. We cannot assume that everyone is on board with irrespective of where we sit. Now, geographically, economically, we need to create consistent messaging. We need to create market-based incentives. We have to make this, no one is going to do it because they should do it. It needs to be in your back pocket that you want to do it. So again, coming to mobility, we're struggling right now to make this market accessible. And we need more research. We need more public sector participation. We also need stakeholders, industry, to see a value in pushing this discussion forward to create large-scale deployment. Now, mass transport has been driving that discussion in India, but the question is, where is mobility as a service today in a post-COVID era? What does that do for electromobility as a question, and clean energy transitions here? But assuming that everyone is on board, of course, is a mistake that many people have made. We've made it, and we have to learn from that.
I think that's very interesting. So we have a few questions that have started coming in, and I just looking at the time, I think we have about 20 more minutes. I'd like to, pose this question that we have received from Shambhavi Sahai about how can we communicate to the user of, products and services around us, the environmental impact that it has. On the one hand, I think it's important, for example, as a practice to let people know what the carbon imprint of their flight would be, or of any particular activity. But at the same time, perhaps having too much information will make you numb to the impact, and you'd kind of take it in your stride because there's no other way anyway. So what are your thoughts on it? Are there any good examples, perhaps in Sweden and other parts of the world, where they've been successfully able to talk about the impact of their day-to-day activities?
This is
Or do you want to?
Yeah,
so Akshat, go ahead.
It's a big challenge. I don't think we figured it out. There was some movement in trying to put, say, the carbon emissions of a product on, just like you have on a food label, you have the different nutrients and calorie information. You also have carbon emissions attached to it. It hasn't taken off. There's been some conversation around it. It is a bit too much information to take in. I mean, how many of us look at the food label unless we are feeling particularly fat that day? And so I don't know if there is a very easy way to do consumer choices differentiated based on emissions, but it's a good challenge to try and tackle.
I'd like to follow up on that, because I think, for example, is that there is so much information. So you do have startups that are getting seed funding to do exactly that, emission-based food control. Farm to table is a huge movement. Of course, plant-based food is another movement in the agricultural sector. And what we're seeing in the Nordics especially is that the startup community is leading the way in this kind of understanding of how to synchronize information, and that I, as a consumer, can find whatever information I need to find, and I use it, and I consume what I need when I need to in terms of information and social media. And what I'm so impressed by and what's happening in the last 2 months is how these entrepreneurs and these startups are moving to kind of embed themselves in a COVID scheme. So they're actually taking their technology solutions, they're taking their social media solutions to a public platform that can actually help us as a community to move forward. So information over information is one thing, but we shouldn't assume that as a consumer we shouldn't have that information available to us, because if it's there, we will use it when we need to. And I think I see that happening here. And I've been on Instagram looking for helping out with plant-based solutions here more than I ever have before. I didn't know Instagram was so active, and it is, but it's all available. You have to find it. And that's, of course, the other challenge of enablers and communicators is how do you find it easily? Because every challenge creates 500 new actors on the market, and that creates a complete cacophony of noise, all with valuable information. But what is our role within the ecosystem as enablers and communicators to consolidate that information in a useful manner?
I just wanted to jump in with a slightly different perspective on the question itself, which is, one of the other things we've seen in terms of data is that actually CO2 emissions have not gone down globally because of the pandemic, despite the economic shutdown in many countries. They have in fact continued to go upwards. So it's very clear that that the kind of transitions we need are not even going to come from this kind of public behavior change. It's going to come from significant transitions in multiple systems. And therefore, while, it's often sort of the burden has been put on the individual in that, if you were more mindful of your actions, the world would be different. It is certainly true, but at the same time, we also have to recognize that at this point in time, given the urgency and the kind of systemic shifts we need, really the buck is at the government's, on the government's table, and we need political will to make the kind of shifts. Personal change, of course, is extremely important, but that's not going to do it by itself.
And I'm going to just urge, this is my urge as a journalist, I'm going to fact check that and then say, actually, emissions have fallen, but your point stands because the emissions have fallen so little. Global emissions are likely going to fall 8%, which from a historic perspective is amazing, but it is still only 8%. We will still be putting out 92% of what we did last year. And so you're absolutely right.
But again, in that, the public sector and the political positioning cannot be a standalone place. We have to work as a team. If industry is against regulations being put down and policy being taken, this will only be a short-term solution. Just to create this multi-stakeholder platform where all agendas are in some way the second best solutions taken forward, where we're not working as isolated parties, but working together. So regulations are only as good as those who will enforce them and recognize them. And that's been a problem in India as well. And I think the PAT scheme was a great way to try and create compromise mechanisms and capacity building to say, we will not enforce this on you. It'll be a step-by-step process that we help you achieve these targets. And that strategy has to be taken forward. Capacity building to achieve where we want to go has to be part of any process we take going forward.
Perfect. So I'm going to move on to another question, which is, I don't have the name of the person who asked the question, but given the economic impact that this crisis has had, that the pandemic has had, or the action, the lockdown due to the pandemic has had, will there be in fact a pushback against, climate action, against action on the environment? You're trying to defocus away from it and instead, go back to the older ways of doing things, which perhaps may make more sense to some policymakers. So firstly, is that going to be the case? And if so, what can be done to prevent going down that path?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. This is something we are going to think about as climate journalists all through this period. And one of the things that you can tell, and we are a few weeks into it now, that the politics of the country matters a lot. And so you're seeing environmental rollbacks at a record pace happening in the US, for example, but not so in Europe, because Europeans are in general more forward-looking on the climate, have a Green Deal in the process. Just today, for example, London's mayor has created the largest car-free zone in the city, has upped the congestion charge for cars to come in, has bailed out public transport, which we are not using right now, but we will have to use once the pandemic is gone. And so back to the point Vinitha was making, if we don't have the politics, and Aarti made this point too, if we don't have the politics and the willingness to follow the regulations that have been created for us, we will go back to square one. The other thing to remember is we will be in an economic recession for a pretty long period. And that typically doesn't fare well for climate. We've seen that during the 2008-9 downturn. There are better signs this time. And my conversations with economists have said that because people in policymaking, in finance ministries and central banks recognize the challenge of climate change, they are more likely to put in policies that are both going to push the economic growth upward and push emissions downward. But that remains to be seen.
But I'll actually just follow up and say that what we see happening, at least in Europe, is that there's this 360 understanding of COVID and climate and a broad spectrum connectivity happening is playing out. So you have this initial kind of funding going out for PPE, for vaccine development, for technology solutions, but we also see now large scale funding coming in for COVID related activities. So climate and resilience and rural urban divide to mitigate the impacts and the stresses there, that's actually coming on the table right now. So we see this move away from in-silo thinking, which is part of the electoral challenge of health versus economy versus agriculture. And we see a collapsing of the 3 or the 4 or the 5 to say, this is actually a solution that hurts us all at the same time in different ways. How do we consolidate financing to plan for that? And consumption is the elephant in the room when it comes to this problem. And things like planned obsolescence and the regulations and the legislations in Europe that will hopefully play out, they will provide market forces to create change. And that has to be taken into consideration as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it's a really good question, and I think Akshat's sort of hit the nail on the head. With that, it is going to be very difficult when the economy is down. There's going to be pushback from industry in ways we've not seen before, and jobs are a huge concern. How are we going to provide for the population? So I think. But I think what's most important is sort of is civil society, is government, and is industry ready to reimagine what the future looks like? And this in some ways the pandemic has pressed a pause button and has sort of forced us to rethink things. So are we going to be able to use that moment and momentum to do something significant? So I think really the ball's in our court in some ways to see how much we can get out of this sort of changed atmosphere.
Okay, I think we can take one or two final questions. There's one that's come in on public transport. So how do we convince people that mass transit is still safe to use? In fact, this is a question that is very strongly related to energy consumption and the transition question, because uh, clean transportation is about public transport. It's about clean public transport. But we now fear that more people, due to social distancing norms, will end up going for two-wheelers as an example. And if these two-wheelers in a country like India are going to be are going to run on petrol, it's going to lead to an increase in energy consumption from the sector, but more importantly also a decrease in emissions, which is already quite high from the two-wheeler segment. So what can be done about this particular? I'm sure this is something that people in this transport sector will be debating for years to come, but your quick reactions to that.
I'm going to jump in. I'm just going to say, trust. In this sector, and what they're saying to us is that we have to communicate trust in the system. And that's something that we start off talking about, is how the consumer has to know the product they're engaging with. And they need to be reassured for all the reasons that there's a problem in public transport.
I would also say that if we do use less public transport in the months, or probably even the next year or 2 years to come, that is okay. Everything we learn about the virus, we realize that social distancing is really important, and if that is to be maintained in the ways we move around, and that means extra fuel consumption and extra emissions in the short term, that is what we'll have to afford. But I think what countries like the UK are doing right now to prop up public transport, to ensure that they have enough revenue to survive this period, and to try and create non-fossil fuel mobility options, be they cycle lanes, be they electric scooters. Those things could make a real impact. And if they accelerate what would have been a mobility future for us 10 years from now, but happens in the next 2 years, that actually might be a good thing for climate.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Akshat. I think at the moment, for example, in India, the migrant labor really need transport. They need ways of getting to where they want to go, and in a safe way and in a dignified way. And so I would say that at this point in time, it's not the emission cost of that, but you're absolutely right that when we think of mobility in cities now, we need safe cycling lanes. I believe lots of people within their cities actually do a majority of their commute is really for reasons other than work. So if that is actually within a range that's cyclable, walkable, and if those are made possible, safe, then we're really talking about designing our cities differently now, or rethinking mobility in our cities. Certainly not investing in the next flyover when we don't have money, but investing that in buses, more buses, electric buses. So I think there are infrastructure choices that actually can be forced now because of budgetary constraints. So we move that money to where it needs to go in public transport.
Okay, fine. So I have a question too. Now, all of us work in very different kind of sectors, so to speak, and at the same time, we all have an overarching belief or desire to be in a world that is resilient to climate change, and that we're able to mitigate the problem in the first place. One of the things that we had discussed with the team when we were kind of planning this particular panel was that we need to find partnerships across different institutions and trying to figure out how we can work together towards this. But my question is that even a desirable thing, in the sense that does collaboration necessarily lead to better outcomes, or does sometimes scrutiny, does sometimes pushing each other on issues also help? So where do you stand on that, and what experiences have you had on that front? Vinuta, would you like to start first?
So actually, Asar actually believes in in trying to create these collaborative spaces, much like Aarti was speaking about, ours is much more in the civil society space, and it has the tensions that you just spoke about, which is that maybe as individuals you move faster than as a group, taking everybody together. But I think what's really important is creating space for being greater than the sum of the parts. And that we've seen happen multiple times now in our Clean Air Collective in India, which has now about more than 100 people, 100 members involved. We've seen that collaborations have now happened across states, across cities, different kinds of organizations coming together, citizens groups having access to science and data which they didn't otherwise. So I think these collaborative spaces, these networks are going to be quite critical in being able to leapfrog in the future. And it's really going to be important to socialize ideas and data and information in a way that individual organizations simply are not going to be able to do.
Perfect. And since we are running short of time, so I'll request Akshat and Arathi to be brief, but I would still love the responses on this.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I used to work at Quartz, which was a small publication. I was one or two people who used to cover climate change. I've come to Bloomberg, which is the world's largest newsroom. And the reason I came was for collaboration, because there is expertise and knowledge across the world that I would like to have tapped into to be able to tell stories. And that collaboration comes with debate. And I think collaboration does not and should not stop debate. So I would be all for collaboration.
Yeah, I would like to just second that. I don't think collaboration and scrutiny should be mutually exclusive. I live in Sweden, and consensus is how things move here. It takes a long time, but consensus really means that you're working through a system where by the end of it, when you come to active deployment, everyone is on board. There is no pushback. There is no kind of reaction in the second stage of not agreeing to what's happening. And so there's a lot to be said for collaboration and consensus building to get a multi-stakeholder agenda on board and to move with that.
Perfect. So I think I could not have summarized this better. I think it's important for us to scrutinize each other, but at the same time, work together towards this larger cause. I'd like to thank you, Arathi, Vinuta, and Akshat, for your insights today, and thank Team Nudge, Team Dalberg for organizing this particular panel on Charcha 2020. Over to you, Nargesh.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Please stay tuned for the next session on clean cooking solutions. We have speakers from Terry, the Clean Cooking Alliance, and BioLite. See you there in the next 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sanjukta. We're going to start at exactly 5. I'll introduce you and then you can take over.
Hello.
This next session will delve into indoor air pollution, which has crippling effects on our most vulnerable populations. Welcome everyone to Clean Cooking Solutions. Our speakers are Ethan Kay, Director of BioLite, Dimphna Vanderlans, the CEO of Clean Cooking Solutions, Debajit Palit, Director of Rural Energy and Livelihoods at TERI, and Manjushri Banerjee, a contributor at the Observer Research Foundation. I'm now going to hand this session over to our in-house moderator, Sanjukta Das, a creative lead at Dalberg Design. Hi, Sanjukta, over to you.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for making time. We have this incredible panel spanning product, policy, research and implementation, advocacy and sector building. And you can find out more about their incredible journey on the Charcha app. And for me, while it is tempting to dive into the deep end of this spectrum of your expertise, intelligence, and experience, I first actually wanted to start with you. I'm sure you must be navigating this new world under the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm curious, how are you as an individual prioritizing in your day-to-day work? What are the assumptions that you think will change or have changed as a result of the current crisis? I'm curious, Dimphna, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. Just making sure everybody can hear me okay. Yes, excellent. So thank you for the question. I do think it's always important in situations like these to start with the individual and to check in with people and make sure people are feeling grounded as much as possible. And so it's very similar to what we have done within the Clean Cooking Alliance, is to make sure that the team feels well taken care of and is able to continue to do their work. So from my perspective as a leader of an organization, I've really focused on making sure that that transition to this new normal was as smooth as possible. Mostly because we need to make sure that the teams are able to continue to do the work that we think is so incredibly important to make sure that billions of people have access to clean cooking solutions, because the core of what we do is really such an important development issue that as an organization, we need to make sure that the teams are well able to continue to do that work. So from my perspective as a leader of that organization, I've focused on the people because they can focus on the work.
Thank you for that reflection. Dr. Debajit, how are you finding your assumptions change or evolve around you as you are in this new world now? Dr. Debajit, I think you're on mute.
Good afternoon. So nothing, the thing is the thing. Can you hear me? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So yeah. Nice question. Nothing much except that and taking necessary precaution. Also trying to see that my team is also safe in their working place wherever they are working. And we do field projects. So also trying to see that our field stakeholders are also doing their whatever they are doing it safely. But more importantly, I think we are not going to office. So as for myself, my carbon footprint has reduced quite a bit. I used to drive 60 kilometers every day. So I think that's a great thing, that I'm not driving or not visiting many places for workshops and events. So, it's a huge carbon footprint. So I think that's a positive side of it. But of course, we all have to keep ourselves safe and maintain all the precautions.
Indeed. I'm just checking if Ethan and Manjushri are on.
Yes, this is Ethan. I'm on.
Hi, Ethan.
Hi.
Yeah, just curious to hear from you. How are you dealing on a day-to-day basis, and how is our work getting prioritized in this new world under the pandemic?
Sure. Thanks for asking. as an organization, our focus has really been on two things. One, protecting the team to make sure that they're safe and healthy, and putting that at the top of our priority list, as well as trying to ensure that we're able to maintain as many opportunities inside the organization for people. We ended up taking pay cuts as a leadership team, progressively staggered, in order to continue to get to do the work we do, but recognizing that COVID had disrupted our plan on the year. And so that, I think, dovetails into the second priority, which is to hope that we can run the organization in such a way that we're able to continue to have this privilege to offer clean energy products to families for years to come. And so we had to, we had to make these cuts in salaries and in OpEx inside the organization in order to protect our future as an organization.
Thanks for sharing your perspective and the situation in your ecosystem. Dr. Manjushri, I'm curious if you had anything to share on how you are dealing in this new world affected by the pandemic, and how that has affected your day-to-day priorities at work and assumptions that you usually would make going forward. I guess we will wait for Dr. Manjushri to get on. She may not be on right now, but I want to come back to Ethan, what you shared, and would love to start hearing from you on, you touched upon this thing around opportunities, and opportunities kind of getting like constraints around this new situation, giving rise to opportunities, or finding ways to sustain, finding ways to continue serving the people that we set out to serve. I would love to start with you and then open up to others as well. How do you think the current crisis shapes these new opportunities, especially in terms of continuing the progress that the clean cooking sector has been for a long, long time? What needs to happen to make sure that these opportunities are not wasted?
Sure. So as a starting point, in many markets, our products had been declared essential services. And that's enabled us to continue to do the work that we're doing. And that's to the credit of governments around the world to recognize that clean energy products have a critical role to play during a time of need. BioLight's work cuts across cooking as well as lighting. And in a pandemic, when families are stuck at home, they value clean cooking more. Everybody's in the house all day long as the food is being prepared. They're not able to go out of their home to charge their phones. They value other appliances, even televisions and radios, which provide access to the outside world in ways that aren't the case before. So I think, interestingly, in some of our markets, we've even seen an acceleration of uptake of products because of the consumer-led value that clean energy products play in families' homes, and there's renewed emphasis on that at this time. On the other hand, I guess as a sector, I think this highlights and underlines the criticality of clean energy products and clean cooking. If everyone is stuck at home while the food is being prepared and can't leave the house, household air pollution levels are higher, exposure levels are higher, and therefore I think it just reinforces the need to have cleaner forms of energy access under a lockdown situation. People can't leave the house to engage in commerce in the same way. So more fuel efficient products again are more critical and more valued by individuals, and more a requirement in society than they are under normal operating conditions. So those are just a couple of the ways that that COVID has, I think, as I said, underlined the criticality of clean energy products for families as well as for society at large, where these physical distancing restrictions are constraining commerce in new ways.
Yeah, indeed. And thanks for sharing that, because that reminds what you talked about in terms of the level of pollutions inside of homes, reminds me of the op-ed piece that Dimfna has. And she definitely highlights on some of the intersectionality with the health outcomes of what it means in terms of the increased risk of people living in conditions where the indoor pollution is actually making them more susceptible to COVID, for example. Dimfna, I'm curious, based on what Ethan said, and we were talking a little bit about the opportunities that situations like these presents for, especially the clean cooking sector, and what are you seeing from your experience of having been in this sector and having built and shaped so much of the sector in your own terms? Just curious to hear from you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I do think that the current situation has allowed us to, with the deeper sense of urgency, to highlight the connection between indoor air pollution, as Ethan was saying, the impact that has on health, or decreased or increased health impacts on the families that are inside the homes, and how they are therefore more susceptible to illnesses and therefore even more likely to have negative impacts of COVID-19. That linkage is so incredibly important, and our ability in this current situation to really highlight that with a deeper sense of urgency is something that we're really pursuing significantly, because we really think that the sector needs increased funding and increased attention, and we're hoping to highlight that connection, that will get more attention towards the sector. I think related to that, what we're seeing within the sector, and I was listening to the previous panel conversation where one of the panelists mentioned that this is actually, it hurts us all, this current pandemic. It hurts everything and everybody throughout different sectors. And I think it's allowing us to de-silo some of our thinking and some of our approaches. And I think the Clean Cooking Alliance is really focused on making sure that we think about the whole ecosystem. We use a whole systems approach to address this issue, because these are big, complicated, systemic issues that we need to collectively address. And so we're seeing opportunities, if you will, to do that even stronger and with a deeper sense of urgency, because we just, in the current economic situation, there's going to be limited financial support for some of the work that needs doing. And so we really want to make sure that we're very careful in how we're spending that money, and very diligent in how we're doing that, and leveraging our partners and leveraging other initiatives, so that replication gets pushed out of the sector more and more and more, because we just don't have the time or the money to continue to operate that way. Yeah.
Indeed. I find it really interesting the way you talked about de-siloing. And for me, that is interesting, especially to hear in terms of the work that Dr. Debajit, you have been doing. You have been deep in the grassroots, working towards and shaping a lot of the policy around rural livelihoods. And to Dimfna's point of de-siloing, how has that played out in the sector, and what does it mean in the current scenario?
Well, so for the future of clean cooking, I think in TERI, we have been doing it, as you rightly mentioned, in two different aspects, both on the implementation of clean cooking programs, as well as the trying to influence the policy, also doing policy, this kind of studies also. So very recently, we came out, I think just before the lockdown, we published a discussion paper on the LPG promotion in India. So as you might be doing, and a lot of studies have been done on the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala program, where the LPG stoves have been provided, but probably not many households are using those LPG stoves. That means LPG is this one, they don't go back for the refill. So the government program itself says that as per the government data only, it says that more than 50%, yeah, roughly more than 50%, if I remember correctly. I think it was 60% odd, this one. Are ones who has not come back for refills or might have come back for just 0 to 3 refills. 0 means they have not come back for refills, or 1, 2, and 3 in the last 3 years. So it actually means that in the last every year they might be taking only 1 refill or maximum of 2. It's something between this one, and some households have not taken any refill. So we felt that it is important that how we improve the adoption of the LPG stove. Just merely giving a connection might not help. The poverty level is so intense that you might have to provide a second level of subsidy so that the adoption level increases. And it's also linked with the indoor air pollution and also the ambient air pollution, because in India, 30% of the external ambient air pollution is because of or can be attributed to the biomass burning. That's what the different studies, the pollution studies say. Now, if you can have a mechanism by which we can improve the adoption rate of LPG in India, then you are addressing not just the indoor air pollution of the rural household, but also the ambient air pollution, which affects the urban households also. So what we suggested is that a second level of subsidy to bring down the price of the 14.2 kg refills to around 315, which is the ability to pay by the rural households, might improve the adoption rate to a large extent. And the amount of money that you have to spend to do this without impacting the fiscal deficit, because the government is very shy about impacting the fiscal deficit. You can see in the stimulus package that are being given, these are designed in such a way that it doesn't impact the fiscal deficit too much. That means these are all loans and other things and not cash dole out. This one. So we have said that maybe a pollution tax of ₹1 on petrol and diesel that is sold in the country is sufficient to address this problem. So on the one hand, you levy a pollution tax on petrol and diesel. With petrol and diesel price now very low, you can easily do it. And whatever money you get from that, you ring fence it and support the LPG adoption in the extremely rural, underprivileged household. This one. So thereby addressing their indoor air pollution problem also. So this could be one way of the increasing the adoption rate of clean cooking. The second point is that we also do a lot of implementation work, and based on our experience, we can say that while it might take little more time, the government will come out with the scheme. It will also take little time for the adoption of stoves and other things. And parallelly, we also have to see that the biomass stoves are also promoted, but a much more improved forced draft biomass stoves, which is almost or rather very low emission from them. So and that also might need a lot of support, and that could also create a rural ecosystem for opportunities for entrepreneurs to start fabricating those stoves. We in TERI has implemented more than 60,000 stoves in Bihar and Jharkhand, and now we are also linked it up with carbon financing and also getting some carbon fund to maintain those stoves. So I think that could be a very good business model for rural entrepreneurs who are desirous of going into this particular business, which will also help the ecosystem to grow and also the rural household. So these are the two things that I see as a huge opportunity, and probably the policymakers should pay attention to it.
Indeed. I definitely have a few specific questions around, because you touched upon user needs, and I think Ethan was also speaking to user needs a little bit earlier on. But before I get into it, welcome, Dr. Manjushri. I'm glad to have you back. I do want to ask a very specific question to you, based on what Dr. Debajit was saying. There was this one aspect of providing subsidies and ensuring that it's not just one-time subsidy that doesn't necessarily lead to adoption and usage. You have done a ton of action research in the deepest of rural parts of India across, and I'm curious if there is more to it than just subsidy. I'm also curious if you have any opinion on how does human behavior in general work when we are actually asking people to switch from traditional or more used to forms of cooking into getting into cleaner options. So yeah, just curious to hear from your experience on that.
Thank you, Sanjukta. So basically, like it's not only one-time subsidy. So it's a very adoption of cooking is based on many factors. Like I would like to share a few of my first-hand interaction as well. Like in the first week of March, I interacted with few households with LPG connection in rural Assam. In spite of having LPG, the primary cooking fuel for everyone remained firewood, and the primary cooking technology was traditional mud stoves. So people, when I spoke to people, they mentioned that firewood is available easily and is free of cost. So the existing cooking behavior and refill cost are the primary reasons for not using LPG much. Again, when we speak about like refilling of LPG, in rural and in the LPG supply depots in rural and semi-urban areas, the supply is also an issue. And this is my first-hand experience as well. Like and during COVID also, there were issues of supply. Immediately after lockdown, in some places, the LPG supply depots announced that they will be able to supply LPG only after 20th of April. So, and this is not only in case of this COVID crisis, but it happens many times otherwise also. And the other thing is distance of the LPG depot is another thing. These factors are there, like your existing cooking behavior and availability of local fuels are important factors of not able to adopt LPG. Even we conducted one action research for induction stoves. In that, we disseminated induction stoves to 4,000 households, and we surveyed 1,000 households. After a year, like what's their fuel usage pattern after introducing induction stove. So we found that 84% of the households, they replaced LPG, means induction stoves replaced LPG in 84% households, and LPG as secondary cooking. So for them, firewood remained the primary cooking fuel, and induction, like electricity, became the secondary or tertiary cooking fuel.
Right. Thanks for that perspective, Dr. Manjushri. I wanted to kind of, it's really amazing because most of us have really grounded these responses here in the user and the end user or the beneficiary or the consumer, as different people would like to call it. I quickly wanted to read out two quotes, and these quotes are part of a study. And this study is being done by Dalberg, which is conducted across 15 states, basically trying to understand the efficacy of government entitlements in helping the BPL families navigate the financial impacts of COVID. And as part of the study, our team has been speaking with people across India, in villages and cities, in peri-urban areas. There are so many people who are stuck right now in cities and do want to go back to homes, for example. I wanted to read out two of those, and they are just quotes. They're qualitative, they're representative, but they are real experiences. And I wanted to follow up with a question, so just bear with me. I used to cook on LPG cylinders, but now I have to use the wood stove. I do not have an Ujjwala scheme. It's very troublesome. Now I have to collect wood for the stove. The forest is quite far away. We have to go in a van, collect the wood, and then come back. It takes a lot of time to cook on the wood stove. We have to keep blowing it. The connection was made on my husband's name, and now we don't have any money for the scheme. The second one is our gas is over. There are no vans coming to give cylinders. The van had come 10 days ago, so we have been using wood to cook since yesterday. If the van comes tomorrow, we will take the cylinder. I don't know if they are going to take money for it. I don't know if anyone is getting free cylinders in the village. The reason I wanted to read out these quotes is clearly that there are many people on the fringes. Either they are in places where access is broken, or they are not included in the system, as we call it. I'm curious about your opinion, perhaps starting with you, Dimfna. How do we address these immediate needs in the critical situation where we cannot necessarily wait to fix the system? And hence, how can the sector elevate some of these user voices?
Yeah, no, I think those are very powerful quotes, actually, and I would love to get them from you and written out form when it's ready. Obviously, it's a really critical situation right now, and we see it across the world, not just in India, but we see it in many other communities where people are now, because of economic changes, are really forced to go out and start collecting wood again, which has such negative impacts on their health, on the climate, the environment. And so the impacts thereof are going to be really quite significant, and we need to collectively really start thinking through how we can address that. In these situations, obviously, governments have a big role to play, I think. And I would love to hear from the doctors how this is playing out in India specifically. I think from our perspective, the support governments can provide to those communities impacted right now is going to be really critical. And we feel a need to incorporate making sure that their populations have access to clean cooking in their response planning. Part of that is through either shifting fuel subsidies or other subsidies that can be implemented directly to the consumers, making sure that the supply chains are much stronger right now in India. But there's also a need for different tax incentives in some of these countries. And so I think that whole packaging on a policy level can be done and should be pursued. We would really encourage those governments to be very thoughtful when they start executing those policy interventions. And more than anything, I think, and Ethan can speak to this, for the companies that are supplying these services, what they need more than anything is predictability in that policy environment. And so the government should be really thoughtful and careful in not making small adjustments that feel too reactionary, but be very thoughtful in planning that out, because Ethan, as a business leader, needs a predictable policy environment. If it's predictable, he can make it work. He can plan around it. He and his wonderful team can plan around that, but it needs to be predictable.
Indeed. Ethan, curious about your perspective on this, given you are in a place where you are the service provider or the product designer of these clean cooking solutions and lighting solutions and others.
Yeah, for sure. Well, firstly, just a quick point on stoves, because as Dr. Debajit said, and in the case of BioLite as well, our stoves are use wood as a fuel source, but in both of our stoves, they cut smoke by at least 90% through the introduction of a fan, which force feeds oxygen onto the fire. BioLite has a novel feature set insofar that it converts some of the excess heat from the fire into electricity, and the electricity in turn powers a fan that force feeds oxygen onto the flame to reduce smoke, as said, and then the surplus electricity comes out the side through a USB port to charge phones and lights. But just want to highlight that, yes, rudimentary biomass cooking has devastating health and climate effects, but stoves like the one that Dr. Debajit was referencing at Terry and the one that BioLite makes can dramatically reduce smoke as well as cut fuel consumption by more than half. So I lived in India for many years. I wrote my PhD on clean cooking in India. My wife is Indian. We had hoped to relocate back to India a few years ago. BioLite operated out of India from 2013 until 2017, at which point the policy environment changed in ways that made it no longer viable for BioLite to operate in India. The reason is we used to be exempted or have reduced taxes and tariffs because we were part of the national biomass cooking scheme. And then when the government of India introduced a national tax, our tax rates went up for clean cooking in ways that made it no longer viable for low-income families to be able to purchase our stoves. So the net result of that is that we had to shut down our business in India and shifted our operating team and products to sub-Saharan Africa, where the regulatory environment has been much more favorable. In East Africa, the tariff rate was reduced to 10%, and the VAT was eliminated, and that enabled unit economics to be attractive, and therefore for families to be able to afford clean cooking solutions. And this, from a personal as well as professional level, is devastating for me. India, of course, has the greatest need out of any market. I have a strong desire to run a clean cooking business in India and to enable our home stoves to reach millions of families across India. But the unit economics and therefore the viability of us continuing to supply products that can address the problem that we're speaking of is no longer possible because of the policy environment. Full stop. If the government of India eliminated taxes on clean cooking, BioLite would invest heavily in India. We would reintroduce our products there. I would probably move my family there. We would scale up operations there. And we would hopefully, over the years, have impact on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families in the market, but which was our intention when we started BioLite 10 years ago. But because of the regulatory environment that you've been speaking of, that's not a viable scenario for us. And so, as has been mentioned a few times, while Ujjwala is part of the cooking solution here for families, it's not a panacea. Other forms of cooking, be it induction cooking, as Dr. Banerjee mentioned, or clean biomass stoves like the ones that Terry and BioLite have been promoting, need to be part of the toolkit or solution set for families. And at least for BioLite, the math doesn't work right now for us to be supplying clean cooking solutions to Indian families.
Indeed, it's natural to look to you, Dr. Debajit, from the point that Dimphna made earlier on the predictability, or rather the unpredictability of policies, and tied into the experience that Ethan shared in terms of the regulatory environment not being favorable enough for the sector to progress. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and the way forward, even perhaps if we have some in your opinion.
Well, let me first say that the two quotes that you just mentioned, this one is a very powerful quote, as rightly said by Dimphna, and raises very pertinent issues. That means these are some of the real issues that are there at the field level, which probably our bureaucrats have not been able to either gauge or take cognizance of this fact. So supply chain is a big issue for LPG. It continues to be a big issue for LPG. The government is trying to address these supply chain issues, but probably they need to do it at a much faster rate, or at least at the rate at which they have disseminated LPG stove. This one. So I think this is one thing that I definitely would like to put in the table. One way to address it at the policy level could be introducing the hub and spoke model. This one. So you have small retailers who can deliver this LPG refills, and you have a distributor who is at the block headquarter, and all those the beneficiaries of Ujjwala can be connected to that block headquarter distributor. Need not necessarily the beneficiaries are connected to somebody else. So in a different block. This is one. This one, yeah. And regarding the biomass stove, this one what Ethan has mentioned, I think he's right in mentioning that there are some policy ambiguity in India, not just for cook stove, but also for other renewable energy devices. One thing that is very important is that we have to acknowledge the fact that whether it is rural or urban area, stove stacking is going to happen. But it is important that we have stacking of clean cook stoves, whether it is LPG, whether it's the electric stove or a forced draft biomass stove, and it is fine as long as there is nothing in the stacking. The polluting stoves are not there, it is fine. Now, having said that, I think we also have to have proper policy on promotion of biomass stoves. As I said, the GST, this goods and service tax on stoves is an issue that TERI is working on with the government. The government has their own arguments. The developer or the implementer has their own arguments. I hope in near future it will be sorted out, and we'll again have firelight in India and more such stove manufacturers in India. We TERI have been working with the local fabricators, and they are still not affected by this thing because they are exempted from the GST. So we are not facing that problem in a big way, and still continue to implement this forced stove by fabricating them from local stove builders. That means I say local at the state level. So their volume of business is not so high that they have to pay GST. They're exempted from paying GST. So yeah, so but I definitely I think that it needs to be addressed, and earlier the better. And try to create an ecosystem where this gets addressed. I think another point that I would like to mention is that we are providing, or rather we are giving too much of importance only to the household cooking. I think one area where we are not giving enough importance at the policy level and also at the implementation level is the institutional cooking. And there, probably the consumption of biomass or inefficient use of biomass is much more than the household cooking. Because you burn large volume of biomass in institutional cooking, in roadside restaurants, in dhabas.
I believe we just lost him for a moment in the connection, but I think he brings up an interesting point as he reconnects. I would love to kind of open it up to reactions to all of you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes,
am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Debajit, you were talking about the over-indexing on household cooking.
Right. And the institutional cooking also need to be looked at, both from the policy and also from the developmental sector.
Mm-hmm. So in fact, that's exactly what I was going to do, because I have had the fortune of asking all these questions. And before we take questions from the audience, I wanted to see if there are questions you would like to ask of each other. To start with, perhaps the point that you made, Dr. Debajit, on the fact that the indexing of household cooking may be a little bit skewed. What do others think about it?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I do think obviously institutional cooking is a really important issue to address. We do see more and more companies that we're working with who are also providing that as an offer, like a product offer to customers. And so I think the combination of the different segments for companies is obviously very attractive, and some of the institutional abilities to pay is actually maybe more solid in certain markets. So I think it's a really interesting combination for some of the companies to pursue that we're working with, combined with the fact that the direct impact of making sure that some of these institutions have access to clean cooking solutions, and those are schools, hospitals, community centers, all those kind of institutions. There's also this apart from just the impact it's going to have on climate and environment and health, there's also an educational aspect that comes with that. And so the more you can show what it means to have access to clean cooking solutions, for example, at a school setting, and children see it, and the chefs that work in those kitchens see it and bring it back to their communities. What we've learned from years of work is that the peer influencing and that awareness raising through these community centers is incredibly helpful and effective. And so as an organization, we definitely try to highlight some of those interventions as well.
Other reactions, Ethan, Dr. Manjushri? Or if you have other questions of each other, I wanted to make sure that we have a little bit of space for that.
I have a question for Dimfin regarding that means I think Global Alliance, India is not part, or rather not a focus country for the Global Alliance. This one, do you think, or do you plan to have India also have, because India has already achieved clean cooking by promoting LPG, and probably that is one of the reasons why India has not remained as focused country for the global alliance. But still, India has a lot of things to provide, lot of lessons to provide to the outside world, and also a lot of things to learn. So India could be excellent test bed for many of the technologies that are being promoted elsewhere or planned to be promoted in African countries on this one. So do you think, or do you have any plan to come back to India?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think we've ever left India, really. And I think, as Ethan was saying, how can you, right? If you really focus on making sure there's universal access to clean cooking solutions, countries like China and India have to be part of that conversation and that narrative. I think as an organization, we're moving away from using the terminology that is a focus country to one where we just realize that these are global issues, that and the learnings that come from how certain countries address it are totally replicable in other countries when that's appropriate, right? So we are really much more focused on making sure that we bring that community together where appropriate, either through convenience, which now have to be obviously a lot more virtual. But yeah, absolutely, Doctor. We're very focused on continuing to share lessons learned. We've actually worked really hard on bringing the government of Ghana together with the government of India to share lessons learned around LPG. And so have facilitated many visits and sort of a collaboration between the two governments so that the government of India can help the government of Ghana accelerate its rollout of LPG. And so there's situations like that where we can really share those lessons learned across the different countries that we work in. We last year awarded the Woman Entrepreneur of the Year award to a female executive in India who runs a wonderful company there. So we work with Chef Kapoor in India to make sure that there's increased awareness and sort of social awareness campaigns around clean cooking in India. So we continue to do and focus a lot on India.
Thank you.
Curious if any other panelists have questions of each other before we move on to some audience questions and perhaps some other ones that I have.
I'm just curious for Dr. Banerjee a little more. She was talking about induction cooking. You know, there's been a movement from a group called MEX to focus more on electric cooking and especially on electric pressure cookers. And for instance, BioLite's been asked to develop an electric pressure cooker. And I sort of scratch my head about the opportunity in sub-Saharan Africa, but if the policy environment changed in India, it strikes me that it would be a really attractive market, given how prevalent and pressure cooking in the non-electric form is to families across India. And I was just curious where she sees that space going and how induction cooking and potentially pressure cooking, what role it plays as part of the fuel stacking strategy, and how promising the usability and adoption levels are around electric forms of cooking, either pure induction, which she mentioned before, or pressure cooking, which could be a more fuel efficient way or electricity efficient way, if you will, of preparing food.
Yeah, thanks. Am I audible? Hello, am I audible? Okay. So like in case of India, like we are aware of the MEX that they went for electric based pressure cookers that they actually piloted in African countries, Kenya, majorly in Kenya, I suppose. So they got a very good response in African countries, and I think they are also promoting this. They are also piloting it in Myanmar as well. So in case of India, like if we see countries like developing countries like India or Kenya, where the electrification rates are really going high, So in these countries, like along with LPG, we can look for electricity-based cooking as well for clean cooking as a clean cooking option. So so with increasing electrification rates, the opportunities for electricity-based cooking will definitely increase in case of developing country, particularly like a country like India. So in case of like when we piloted, we found that infrastructure that time, like around 3 years back, the infrastructure was not like supportive enough, like to support all the 3 meals in induction stoves. But gradually with improving infrastructure, like when we spoke to people, like people are aware of the convenience of cooking with LPG and with induction stove. The major thing in case of LPG was like cost of refilling, the supply issues, and also like access issues. And in case of induction stove, the major issue for not using it regularly was they were fearing their electricity bill will increase. And the second point was uh, the infrastructure was not supportive enough. In particularly in rural India, like if like they cook 3 meals, like then it was not supportive. Like if 5-6 households together will cook, then there might be some issues with load. So at present, it's at a very nascent stage. So definitely, again, the MEX is also trying for solar-based pressure cooking as well. I went through their technology. So these options are also there, but definitely they are very costly to use at grassroots level.
Can I add 2 things to that, if I may, real quick?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think it's what's great about this example is that as the Clean Cooking Alliance, we do see a lot of like really innovative new technologies and new business models and different approaches that are emerging in this sector. And so I want people who are listening to this to come away with a sense of optimism, because there are really good things happening in this sector that are really inspiring, like wonderful leadership, just really good innovations. And when we work with companies in our venture catalyst, like the cohort that we've recently selected, there's really inspirational stories there for people that are truly committed to making sure families across the world have access to clean cooking solutions. And so this broad suite of options that are now increasingly available and hopefully more and more affordable is just really inspiring to see. And I think it's important for people who listen to this to sort of really think about the innovation that's happening in a sector where historically people didn't necessarily think about that as an innovative sector. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight and make sure we don't forget is just the impact of not having access to clean cooking solutions and COVID-19 in humanitarian settings. And I think it still gets sometimes missed in conversations like this, the impacts of COVID-19 in those really already very dire situations and horrible circumstances is going to be really significant if you think about access to clean cooking as well. So I just wanted to make sure we don't forget about that really complicated situation that I think the global development community also needs to think about.
Indeed. Thank you. I'm going to tie in a question that I think relates exactly to the point that Dimfna was making, and it's an audience question. What are the panelists' thoughts on investing in large-scale community kitchen or scaling them to meet the chronic hunger emerging as a result of COVID-19 crisis? Many states in India have shown community kitchens to work, for example, Kerala and Assam. So to Dimfna's point of not forgetting to stay optimistic and using that energy to focus on what are some of the immediate needs in the global development community. Just curious, Ethan, maybe we'll start with your thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, to put things candidly from the perspective of a product developer, number one, it takes us a couple of years to bring a product to market. Number two, if you take the home stove, for instance, it literally cost us millions of dollars to develop the home stove. So we would want to have confidence that the scale of the market opportunity is both large enough and sustained enough that there's a continued use case and preference for community cooking going forward, for at least for BioLite to be able to make investments in those areas. And then also just with the to flag that, you know, hopefully we have a vaccine in place over the next 18 months or so. So by the time BioLite has a product in market that's a good fit for a community cooking context, hopefully we're not talking about COVID anymore, at least not from the perspective of being exposed to it. So I think at least for us as an organization, we're not well placed to support the urgent need of community cooking, given the solutions we have at present are exclusively for individual families, and the customer segment that we focused on to date has always been at the household level. But you know, it's a great point and a great question, and I think organizations like Terry that have a range of locally developed solutions that and probably a capacity to develop a community-based solution or to roll out one that already exists would be better situated at this juncture to support that really urgent need that the question flagged.
Yeah, I believe, Dr. Debajit, you were trying to make a point right after what Dimpna was saying. So just curious to hear that, and to the point that Ethan was making around community kitchens, given the emerging challenge of hunger right in this pandemic and after.
Yeah. So as far as community kitchen is concerned, I think what is happening in India right now, as far as my information, is that in most of the urban areas, that means in cities like Delhi or Noida or Mumbai, Bangalore, mostly the community kitchens that are being run to provide food to these migrant workers are mostly on LPG, based on LPG. However, there are solutions in Terry which can run on biomass too, high efficiency biomass gasifier cook stove, which can prepare food for 100, 150, 200 persons at one time. We have implemented those solutions at not for during this time, but earlier in different institutions, and those are readily available, can be fabricated and used by somebody who would like to have that or use them. This one would be very happy to provide those solutions. This one. I'll just go back to what about the induction or electricity-based cooking. I think the government of India, primarily the Honorable Prime Minister, is very keen to have electric cooking in India. Some competitions are also run for solar-based electric cooking. And there are a couple of, or maybe three, at least I know 3 entrepreneurs who are working on solutions based on electricity for cooking. 2 are based on solar electricity-based cooking, and 1 is solar thermal-based cooking, which is a completely new type of technology, not the traditional solar thermal cook stove. This one. So I'm sure that these technologies over a period of time, maybe in the next 1 or 2 years, would move from the beta testing to a more commercial testing. And if they can get the right finance, probably they can also launch this product for large scale dissemination.
Indeed. Recognizing that we have 4 minutes to go, I did want to create the space for all of our final thoughts on this talk, but I hope this is a conversation that doesn't end here, given this incredible spectrum of people who have such great potential for showing the hopefulness of the sector, as Dimpna put it. So if I may open perhaps with you, Dr. Manjushri, what, in your opinion, is perhaps the most urgent need for the clean cooking ecosystem to address in this scenario? And if at all there is a best practice that you are following that you would like to share with others?
Yes, Sanjukta. Like in our case, what I would suggest that, in my opinion, like in this COVID time, it's important to it's important to increase the usage of clean cooking. It's not only access. So when we look at our scenario, so we have to like include in clean cooking solutions not only LPG but also a local cooking fuel. Maybe in our case it's like firewood. Like we need to promote improved cook stoves as well along with LPG, so that the users at grassroots are able to like have access to clean cooking rather than like only depending on one cooking stove. So the need is like to mix LPG along with local cooking behavior.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Dr. Debajit, what are your thoughts on the urgent focus that needs to be for the clean cooking ecosystem?
So my thoughts, I would urge the government that the support for LPG for the underprivileged households should continue. I don't call it a subsidy. I call it a support because it also helps in reducing the ambient air pollution, which otherwise is a big problem in India. So you are actually not subsidizing, you are actually incentivizing the rural household to use LPG so that the urban households can get rid of this ambient air pollution. This is one. Two, definitely explore the electricity-based cooking also, this one. And the best practice that you just mentioned, I think is important for us, that while we take precaution for and continue to follow social or physical distancing, but at the same time, we should have emotional closeness. Otherwise, the distancing will create more problem in future. This one, and last but not the least, we all should take precaution for our care for our eye, as we tend to use more and more mobile phone and laptops for even during these conferences and events like this. This one, so it's very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Debajit. The irony of it that we are on Zoom.
Yeah,
sharing
absolutely.
those best practices.
Absolutely.
Yeah, over to you, Ethan. At least even in your ecosystem, what is your immediate priority, or what is your hope for the ecosystem to be prioritizing?
If the government of India is serious about addressing household air pollution, it needs to eliminate taxes and tariffs for clean cook stoves. Clean biomass cook stoves. LPG is certainly an important part of the mix, but it is not a silver bullet. It's a super complex business to maintain, to keep safe. The logistics are very complicated. All of these issues have been flagged already. And for low-income families, as has been mentioned in this call, LPG cannot comprehensively solve their clean cooking needs. Also, it's a non-renewable resource, so it's not a long-term solution. And so I think the work being done on electric cooking is exciting, but as Dr. Banerjee said, it's very nascent. We have right now technologies that can deliver clean cooking at scale that are not in India because of the regulatory environment in India. So my final thought is that the government of India needs to eliminate GST on clean cook stoves, and ideally as well reduce or eliminate tariffs on stoves in order to enable widespread access across the country. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. And lastly, coming to Dimfna, please take us home with your thoughts on the urgency of the focus of the clean cooking ecosystem.
Yeah, I think over everything that's already been mentioned, I would say two key priorities from our side. We need to continue to support companies who are indeed the ones who are going to deliver innovative solutions to this market. And as an organization, we fundamentally believe that that's what's going to get us to the scale that's needed to address the issue. So continued strong support for companies in the weeks, months, and years ahead. And then secondly, I think a high priority that we should never lose sight of what we're trying to do, which is serving the families, and never lose sight of the fact that significant impact this has on women and their children. And so just to always have that in the back of our minds, I think in situations like this is something we can never forget.
Thank you. Thank you for grounding us in the journey that was actually for who it is and what need it is supposed to serve. Thank you for that. big thank you to all of you for making time and creating this incredible spectrum of perspectives. We hope the conversation only continues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sanjukta. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining the session. We're now going to move to the future of green transport systems, which is going to start in just another minute. On our panel, we're going to have Revati Prabhu, Executive Director, Cities at Freshman Prabhu, Ashwin Mahesh, Co-founder, Lithium Technologies, and Anand Shah, from co-founder of Ola Electric. Our moderator for this session is going to be Vignesh Nandkumar, and I'm going to hand it over to him directly right now. Vignesh, are you there?
Yes, can you see me?
Yes, absolutely.
Hello. Hi, good evening, everybody, and great to have everybody on the call. Obviously, I think there's a time difference. We have people joining in from different continents as well, which is fantastic, given that anything sustainable is a global effort too. I want to take maybe just a minute introducing our panelists, and then maybe we jump into the conversation after that. So we have Revati, who is dialing in from London and Executive Director at the Freshman Group. One of the things that she comes with is years of experience with urban planning, as well as being an architect. Did a lot of master planning for projects around the world. And specifically, Revati's passion is talking about things from a sustainable transit point of view. So Revati, look forward to your views today on that. We also have Anand Shah. Anand, are you here?
I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, hi Anand. Clearly very green background. Anand, has been an environmental champion for many decades. I think starting with work that he's done in the water and energy side, and subsequently in the transportation side, all looking at both what can be top-level strategies as well as implementations from a commercial and government perspective for sustainable energy, sustainable water and transportation. And then we have Ashwin Mahesh with us, a very interesting combination of a climate scientist, an astronomer, as well as somebody who's done a lot of work around urban development and governance. He wears many hats, one of which is a co-founder of Lithium, which operates the first and largest fleet of electric cars in India. In his otherwise spare time, I think Ashwin also has passions that go into urban transportation systems as well as education. So glad to have you all. I think we have about an hour, and just to set the context, everybody might have received with the low friction of information transfer on WhatsApp, photographs of people being able to see the Himalayas from Jalandhar and so on, and the impact that clean air has on not only the health but the general feeling of well-being, right? And I'm sure you each have anecdotes of your own. But the question is in everybody's mind. It's great when it lasted, but how long will we enjoy this? It's been wonderful, etc. So I think if we were to take the context of what COVID the pause in the entire fossil fuel driven transportation has made us realize, I want to probably start with Revati and ask the question, what are people going to look at? If you've looked at urban planning, you've looked at a number of options for transit. How do the public places transform now? both for personal mobility and public mobility. So
Sure.
if you could give the top 2 or 3 things that you are envisioning and imagining things to change?
Sure, sure. So first, thank you for having me on the panel, Vignesh. It's a really interesting topic. And you mentioned the future of green mobility, but for me, the future is now, COVID has split it into 2 parts. One is sort of the pre-vaccine future, and one is the post-vaccine future. So in the pre-vaccine future, which is what we're all experiencing right now, and it's unfolding in real time, all the things that we know that stand for good urbanism, public transportation, public spaces, markets, shops heaving with people, festivals, everything has been very badly impacted. And we have, like you said, you can see the Himalayas. We can also see, equally surprisingly, empty roads, completely free of congestion. So for urban planners and city authorities, there's been a lot of very interesting innovation and experimentation on what we can do with these newly released assets. And cities like London and Paris as well have taken a very proactive stand in sort of reclaiming road space for pedestrians and cyclists, which is as green mobility can get. And the thinking is that if we can sort of convert a lot of people from other forms of transport to cycling and walking, maybe in the post-vaccine future, these habits will continue and these behaviors will continue. So that's something we want to see what happens. There have been a lot of interesting innovations on shops and cafes that are now slowly opening up. And I had a beautiful graphic from a colleague in Los Angeles the other day, where cafeterias, which have very small space and now need to follow social distancing, have been allowed to spill onto the streets, just like markets, just like other commercial establishments, to follow the social distancing. A third colleague sent me an image of a massive parking lot which is being converted into an open air cinema. People have been really isolated and wanted to have some kind of shared experience, and this way you can be safe in your car and yet have this collective experience. So a lot of new thinking is going on. But like I said, what really where my head is what that post-vaccine future is going to look like. Because COVID, especially for Indian cities, I think has shone a very harsh light on how broken our cities are. And especially for the really vulnerable populations, I think we've not done very well at all. So when I think of green mobility for the future, my thinking is, how are we going to use this green mobility for these vulnerable populations to make more humane and more inclusive cities? And very quickly, 3 levers that come to mind, and I'll stop because I know we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. The first bit is, and all 3 levers are super basic. They're not sexy, futuristic, so forgive me, I'm going to get down to the basics. Footpaths, pedestrian infrastructure, super critical. Our cities have really not taken this as a priority. In every transport project that we're involved in, pedestrian infrastructure comes at the bottom. And we've seen from our studies on the smart cities that in some places up to 60% of car journeys are actually for short journeys, which could very easily translate on foot. So very large priority there. I know there are concerns about hot weather, encroachment, but they're very creative solutions for all of them. Needs a lot of commitment and sort of political will as well. The other big lever, which is also the sort of less loved sibling in the family of public transport, is buses. So I think the star of the show is always the metro. All cities love metros. All politicians love metros. Then comes the BRT, and then the lowly, humble, forgotten bus. There's been chronic lack of investment in buses, and I would love to know from my fellow panelists how electrical buses or fuel cell based or battery based are going to help support public transport in cities, particularly in smaller cities where the density does not support metro lines. And then finally, combining both those, the sort of walking infrastructure and the public transport, is the idea of transit-oriented development, which most of us are aware of, and we call it TOD, which in essence is a walkable neighborhood that is anchored around a transit station, whether a metro rail or normal rail or a bus junction. And that responds very well to the challenge that COVID has actually put out, which is that we are able to work, live, play, learn in the same neighborhood. And I think a lot of cities are using the TOD idea. Delhi is a great example to fulfill the shortfall in affordable housing. So this comes back to my idea of how can mobility actually impact in creating a more humane city. Also, businesses are realizing the folly of investing in very large spaces in expensive real estate. So could these TODs become mini CBDs, which then start to take jobs into their sort of purview, support the local economy, and create a more localized kind of living? So I'll stop there and would love to hear thoughts from the rest.
A lot of interesting points, and I'm sure there's also questions panelists have for each other. So we'll get to that quickly. I'm seeing a lot of questions from the participants as well. But you had made a point about affordable transportation, making sustainable transportation affordable, and I'd want to call upon Ashwin. You have been also involved with urban transport development, finding a way for more people to use the public and the private. So are you seeing that now people have become aware of the need and the impact of sustainable transportation? What are the ways you're seeing that the whole tag of being expensive, of green transportation being expensive, can be done away with, and it can become affordable and mainstream? What are some of the trends that you're seeing there, Ashwin?
Clean transportation is expensive by and large only for personal vehicle owners. Clean transportation is already competitive for any kind of shared use. And in the future, it'll get even more powerfully competitive. And so so a lot of people have been saying, for example, that the adoption is slow. Yes, the adoption is slow, but when it happens, it's going to still happen in a rush. I believe that. It's about vehicle availability. It's about another round of innovation and technology. I'm pretty sure that within 5 years, we'll have vehicles that can charge in 5 minutes and go 1,000 kilometers. And at that point, unit economics will be so favorable to electrics that everybody will want to get out of diesel. I think that'll happen. The issue we're seeing on the streets is really not so much about mobility alone. It's about housing too. People don't have equitable access to housing or affordable access to housing, even if not equitable access to housing. Because they don't have access to housing, they live by and large outside the cities. They live in places that seem affordable because they're either settlements that are illegal or the cost of rent in such places is ridiculously low, but the conditions are also ridiculously poor in such places. And when you live outside the city, you have to commute for work, and there is traffic. A lot of what we see as traffic is just the misalignment between where people live and where they can work. And so, and maybe for that reason, there's a tendency to think that we need to think of these work-live combinations in ways that address that. And I know Revati sort of referred to that as well. But I don't think more than 30% of jobs lend themselves to that kind of combination. There are jobs that you simply can't do on a live near my place of work kind of basis. And I think they are the majority. It's unfortunate. I mean, and that's one part. But the second part of it is that if you truly built formal housing for all the people who now live in informal housing, you would probably end up with a city that's 2 times the size that it is today. And I think those are the realities. People vote with their feet, people vote with their wallets, and that kind of voting is a lot more common than voting on election day by going and pressing a button. What we are seeing is people making the choices that seem accessible and affordable to them. And those choices have nothing to do with city planning for the moment, because city planning doesn't speak to such people. I believe transportation should be cheap. that public transportation should be ridiculously low cost, that people can take it, and it should be accessible, and it should be available in every neighborhood. I think I'd like to see that. But I don't think, unless we make massive investments in that direction, and even if we make massive investments in that direction, given how much of a backlog we have allowed to build up over the last 15, 20, 30 years, it's at least 15 years away to get to anything that seems remotely approaching the kind of situation that we want.
So today you see more technology driving that affordability and usage, because there's a lot more sprawl, right, that is getting created. And let's take that up when we come to the investments question, which I have shortly for all the panelists. Anand, you've been seeing development of technologies that can go from what started off as a small government project to a large market adoption, whether it's in water or in energy, renewable energy particularly. So when we talk of shared, and with your inceptional work from Ola Electric and your continued involvement in the electric space there, where do you see, the opportunities are clear, but where are you seeing the challenges for shared? One is the COVID whole social distancing, but that's something that people are coming across to living with it. But in a general sustainable transportation mode, what are the challenges you're seeing with the shared shared transportation approach, and how are some of the startup ideas addressing them, not just in India but across?
Yeah, so look, I think the entire shared mobility space has a big question mark on it at the moment, given what COVID has done. But what is clear is that as markets get wealthier and the cost of moving gets cheaper, is people tend to move more. At least that's been true over the last decade. And moving more has to get filled somehow, right? And I think that shared mobility has played a role in that, whether it is ride hailing, or it is bike sharing, or it's the Yulu type model, or it's lithium, or whatever it may be. I think that's going to continue with modifications in some form, because it's an extension in some way of public transit. It's a stopgap measure, right, between cheap and super shared and less cheap and still shared, that has a little bit of the idiosyncrasies of what people would like, whether that's comfort or space or on demand or not having to wait. There's a bunch of questions around that. The general sense has been that we're moving from this concept of I need my own vehicle, my own space, to I want a more efficient, more rational path to getting where I need to go. And all the other questions of whether I live near there, why am I going there? Some of those may be up in the air today, because I think our relationship with time and space are going to change as well. Right? I mean, the increased traffic on Zoom is directly proportional, inversely proportional to the decrease in traffic on the road. And some of that may stay, right? Out of convenience, out of many other things, that people realize that I'm more active spending 3 hours in calls than I am getting to the office, which is based on some 19th century idea of, the way society ought to be organized. So the short answer to you on shared is I think shared will continue to expand. In what form, I don't know. I think it is an extension and an intermediate form of public transit, and I hope it continues to move that direction. Like Ashwin said, I think that the way I think about this is that users who drive or use vehicles at high levels of utilization tend to be rational, and they make purchasing decisions and usage decisions on economic rationality. And I think that will continue. Oil prices may be dropping, but so are the prices of batteries and everything else. And I think that awareness of environmental impact of people and our habits is also very significant, if not more than ever. And hopefully that leads to enlightened decisions also from the policymaker side, which is if we're going to pour money into stimulus, that we also nudge the country or society to move in a direction that everybody wants. But the driver for that will be rational movers. It'll be buses, it'll be fleets, it'll be shared mobility. It's not going to be the individual who says, oh, I have to pay more for a vehicle that you need to convince me emotionally I want.
Can I just add to that point, Vignesh?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Very quickly, I mean, we need to understand that mobility is not just one creature. It is sort of an integration of lots of different things. So it's not just walking, it's not just Ola, Uber, it's not the rickshaw, everything combined. And I think in Indian cities, it's never a question of either or, it's and, because of the conditions that we have. So this is a very important sort of integrated perspective to have, not just on the various modes, but also the way they are conceived and delivered by the authorities.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's why I think this is not something that you could solve with one solution, especially as Ashwin put it, there's a huge backlog created. Therefore, you need all types in there. And in fact, I was going to say, if you move to solutioning, and there's a lot of, at least in India, there's a lot of emphasis in the government's announcements around focus on the local, work towards a lot more, solutioning that can be done in India, developed in India for Indian conditions and so on. And, we had a small poll where we are seeing a mixed result, whether the audience believes that having seen the experience of a dust-free and a pollution-free environment today, they would be more motivated to invest in whatever it takes for sustainable mobility. And I think, it's a sort of fair distribution. There's nothing that is standing out. It shows, at least in this selected audience, that it's not clear whether governments will take the necessary steps strongly or not. Though one could argue that about half believe that governments should be motivated, right? So the question is, given that, what are the two key things each of you believe that the Indian government can focus on for the sustainable mobility piece? Obviously, it is very much tied to housing, and I think that's a very interesting connection that all three of you have brought up, and the fact that jobs and what people do determines, right? Some of it you can't do sitting at home, some of it you can get on a Zoom call and do it. So if you were to be in a government panel and you have the authorities listening to you, could you share with the audience two things that you think they can go after to build a sustainable mobility piece, with the focus on the local investments? So maybe I'll start with you, Anand, and then we go back to Revati.
Okay, back to it. I think that it's a hard question to answer in terms of specifics given where things are going, but my answer would be simple. As I'd say, look, that the opportunity hasn't changed, right? The tension has. So if we're talking post-COVID, like the tension is you have this industry that is entrenched, has been around for a long time, that needs to be saved because it involves lots of jobs, and therefore the tendency will be let's relax on our pressure to move towards sustainable mobility. And I think actually it should be thought of the other way, right? If you are looking for a leapfrog opportunity to skip forward, especially in the case of India, where it doesn't matter whether oil is at $10 or $100, we still have to import it, right? And that the long game of that ends up being the same. We are going, sustainable in terms of electricity generation. We still need to find a way to deploy it, right? And that again moves the mega trend towards being able to be a player in an industry and mobility that could be cleaner, right? So the argument to me would be, in this moment, rather than going after the low-hanging fruit, figure out how to leverage the opportunity it presents for us to build for the future. And in this case, it's infrastructure for sustainable mobility. However the city ends up evolving, however our habits end up evolving as human beings, however work habits end up evolving, at a fundamental level, the game here should be to double down, not back off.
Right. And any specific things, Anand, given your long history of working with the governments, that you think what was being done can be accelerated forward? As you said, double down on the opportunity. So any specific ideas that were already being worked on that can be accelerated today in India?
Well, I think Revati signaled buses as being an opportunity. I mean, I think in terms of sustainable transportation, frankly, buses, rickshaws, other shared fleets, whether it's fleet owners that are doing employee transport or others, are low-hanging fruit. I think pushing anybody who's got an economic reason to go clean, there should be incentives for, potentially non-fiscal incentives for. And when you start seeing them, everybody's confidence goes up. Right? Imagine if you were in Delhi or in Mumbai or wherever, and all the buses were electric and all the auto rickshaws were electric. Like, it gives people hope and promise and imagination. So in my view, I get specifically focused on what you can execute rather than trying to boil the ocean.
Excellent. And Ashwin, your 2 points on what, if they were listening to you. Ashwin, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, sorry. There are 2 things. Somebody asked a question on the Q&A. How would you convince the middle classes to come to public transport? And I would actually flip it on its head and say, take the public transport to the middle class. The problem, you have to look at what's happening in Indian cities. The cities are sprawling. People who have money are leaving the city too. It's kind of an interesting thing. This didn't used to be the way things were in India. But a lot of these well-off neighborhoods are now actually coming up outside cities, and there's far more scatter between them. And as a result, there's more circumferential movement than radial movement alone. But if you look at our public transport systems are still addressing the parts of metropolitan areas which were historically the city. Like if you look at Bangalore Metro, so 97% of Bangalore Metro is in places that aren't even growing in population, right? In some ways, you have to now say, how do I bring public transport within 400 meters of every house and within 150 meters of every major center of employment? If you answer the question by saying, it's not about bringing people to these systems, it's about taking these systems infrastructurally to those people. That's one thing that governments can clearly do. But the second thing is also important. I think you have to think about sustainable mobility and public transport in particular, alongside non-motorized mobility. There's an element of walkability and cyclability, which is also an important part of the solution set. But we operate with one bizarre mindset in budgets. 10,000 crores for a metro, a few hundred crores to 1,000 crores for a bus, 20 crores for a pedestrian thing. And it's almost like the more people that do it, you're gonna give less money to it. It's really bizarre. And there's a preference for really expensive infrastructure projects that only get developed at the speed at which the population is growing anyway. And so their carrying capacity is primarily to serve the additional marginal population at best, right? So that's just never going to work. I think you have to imagine mobility in a more sort of integrated way that says, look, and also if you look at a lot of cities, they make no distinction between primary arterial infrastructure and non-primary, non-arterial infrastructure. In Bangalore, you can't tell by road width alone or by traffic volumes alone whether this is an important road or not, because it's kind of like a bizarre situation that the importance of the road is not manifest in how traffic is on that street. So I think you have to pick primary infrastructure. You have to look at the neighborhood level thing. You have to look at non-motorized transport, and you have to connect all of that to sustainable mass transit as well. Now, this story has been beaten to death. It's not like anything I say about this is new, but historically it's never happened. That fundamentally the political class still prefers investments in large infrastructure, which doesn't move a lot of people anymore. And by and large, in fact, the bus companies should be actually quite concerned about it. Even government-owned bus companies are now coming to the conclusion that government's preference for metro is actually making bus less important in cities, even though buses carry way more people and will continue to carry way more people than these mass transit systems that they're imagining. I've seen people at BMTC tell me that they're being treated like some orphan child of the government while they're willing to put thousands of crores into a metro line. And I think that's a legitimate concern to have. So it's this convergence of sustainable and non-motorized together and the public transport together. So you have to imagine this as a canvas in doing this stuff.
And Revati, I think this sort of dovetails to sort of the context you had also set at the beginning of the conversation on sustainable transportation being multimodal and combination of both how people live and how they move around. So, what would you want to add? It almost sounds like you've got this. So.
Yeah, I think we came back to the starting point very well, and all seem to agree on where the issues are. I would add one more thing is that, thinking about it about land use and mobility together is not new, as Ashwin was saying. We've struggled with this for several years. It's the actual departments that are still in silos. So I think there needs to be a lot of design, and maybe this pre-vaccine time that we're getting in designing departments to work together and creating institutions and processes and delivery mechanisms which are integrated. So I would put that as a very high priority. And then I'm coming back to the bus that I feel very bad for because it gets no money and no love and attention. There have been some serious issues with gap funding, as well as, how public and private companies integrate in contractual ways. So these are sort of the nitty-gritty of many reasons why the bus sector has declined so significantly. And I think we should take this time to actually look at it and look at it as a very effective instrument for masses of people to be moved sustainably.
Right.
So the bus.
The bus network. So I think there's a lot of convergence on the ideas around, keep the public transport as close to people, help people use more of the public transport. But if I can also, present some of the realities on the fact that oil prices are low and people may see that as a means to actually get more personal transport. There's at least in India, there's some degree of aspirational value attached to personal transportation. And so let us say, there's a large section of population that should move to sustainable transportation by addressing the public transport network to be sustainable, whether it's through buses, non-motorized transport, etc. And then there's also a section of the population that would want to have a personal transport, that caters to their personal needs, which may or may not be solved by the bus network in the short order. So in that context, and my last question to the panelists before we throw open for the audience to ask questions is, what are some of the trends you're seeing in the large scale mobility transportation networks that can be addressed today, to make them more sustainable? One is, of course, cycle more, create pathways for cycling, create sustainable bus networks. And then there's a section that wants to look at it. And if you see the poll that results of the audience, of course, of the microcosm of this audience, a lot more are saying, given the health and societal benefits, I would be even willing to go with this on a non-fossil fuel based transport medium, even if it costed 10% more, right? And maybe we have an audience that's extremely enlightened. But in the personal mobility space, outside of what can be catered by sustainable public transport system, what are some of the developments you're seeing there? Ashwin, if you could start this conversation, and then we'll open up the questions, the floor to the audience for questions.
So instead of thinking of it purely as personal mobility, let's think of it as personal decision, right? Because then the universe of people who can drive this is even bigger. All purchasing managers for transport can drive this decision. It's not personal mobility, but it's really their personal decision to decide whether a fleet goes electric or not. And so if they make those kinds of decisions, it could be really large decisions. The question your poll should really have asked is to say, given that electric is already competitive with diesel in so many sectors, how come you haven't already made the decision to go electric, even though you're saying, even if it was 10% more expensive, I would do it? There are a lot of guys out there who are saying, even if it was 10% more expensive, I would do it, but are not doing it, even though it is not even 10% more expensive. That's the problem. So the problem is to say, how do you get this knowledge to more people? that electric is in fact competitive, number one. Second, how do you have a market segment-wise development of what's quickly possible with electric and make an all-out thrust to get those segments to go electric? Because I think if we had 3 or 4 market segments where the tipping points happen, that would effectively turn all the market segments in one shot after that. You really need, like we've seen this at Lithium, right? When we started out with this 2-door car, and a lot of people said, who's ever going to agree to go in this 2-door car? And maybe even you said that, Vignesh, I don't know. But, but there were also a set of people, and I'll count you in this also. There were also a set of people who said, you know what, this is not the right car, but we're going to do it anyway. Because doing it in this car that's not the right car is what's going to get us to the right car. And I think for every market segment, there's a set of believers. Companies tend to imagine their progress almost as though there are no believers, but things don't change because the mass decides first. Things change because believers decide first. So you have to figure out how do you get these believers to do things, and how do you get them to do things in a way that has signaling value for a much larger set of the population, right? The vehicles have an advantage. They run on the street. The very act of seeing the vehicle on the street, it helps. I remember a conversation with Chetan Mining some years ago when he said, about most of the people who bought these vehicles for personal transport ran them 60 to 100 kilometers a week. We run 60 to 100 kilometers on each of those vehicles every 8 hours, right? So, and what is it that convinces people this is doable? It's the act of seeing an electric vehicle do 250 to 300 kilometers a day on the street in front of them, right? That convinces people. I think you have to work with the believers, and you have to create a signaling system that gets everybody else on board.
Right. And so just to take that point a little forward, Anand, if you were to build on how do we get the believers to see this more, and you want to, you were to unpack what would it take to get to see this more on the streets, and given your work with Ola Electric, Anand, what are some of these signaling factors and the next level that can help us see more of these on the street? What do you think needs to be expanded right now?
Look, I think Ashwin is right in that the believers who are not going to take no for an answer are innovators who are going to push it, right? I don't think this is a government problem alone, right? The government needs to get out of the way and let people move. But there's enormous amounts of stuff. Let's be clear that the only things that move are not people, right? Garbage moves, goods move, right? Like there are lots and lots of stuff that moves in a city and in society in general that need a vehicle to get there. But part of it's a financing opportunity. Part of it is, can someone reinvent the auto rickshaw? Can someone invent the better milk delivery vehicle? Can someone electrify the push cart that the vegetable vendor uses where he's walking 30 kilometers a day, right? Can buses go electric, right? There are many, many, many things. The Swiggies and the Zomatos and all these people who are doing, deliveries every day. Can they think differently about how they get there? Like, there's a lot of opportunity if you're an innovator. And right now, being an innovator often is not just difficult in the nature of innovation. It's a more difficult path than buying the petrol vehicle and doing what you're doing now, right? And so I think that making it easy for the sort of, whatever they call it, animal spirits of Indian ingenuity to find solutions that are built on the backbone of a kit that says sustainable transportation, whatever that might be, I think is personally a very big opportunity. Like in my view, like you look at one of these questions that we had was on, sort of first and last mile, transport. That's true of everything. First and last mile is everything. If we look at the government's view today, it's about first and last mile when it comes to buy local, whatever, support your local guy. When we think of buses, we're talking about first and last mile because it's more flexible to be able to get further into where people go, right? Now, at the end of the day, we actually have very interesting solutions, but they were designed 60 years ago, right? Whether it's a auto rickshaw, it's a shared thing, or it's moving this, or it's the shuttle car that's the Maruti van that picks up 20 people to get to the next last mile point. Like those innovations exist, right? And they're actually ginormous opportunities. And they're ginormous opportunities that we should unleash innovators to be able to deliver on. And I think you'll see proof points. Once you see the cars and vehicles going, people think their imagination opens up. You see a Yulu vehicle, your imagination opens up. You see somebody driving on an electric bicycle, your imagination opens up. You see a lithium vehicle, your imagination opens up. You see an electric bus, your imagination opens up. You see an electric airplane, your imagination opens up. That's the key.
So, and I think that's sort of what would trigger also a lot more adoption, right? One is people start imagining things, and then you say, okay, how can we adopt it given it's an immediate need, or it gets us to do things in a better way. And so, Revati, from your standpoint, what, as you see some of this, there's also aspects that need to be done in the transit planning mode, right? So if you want to see more of these electric bicycles or electric cars, it needs to be planned. And how do you see some of the changes that need to be done towards this adoption for a green transportation at the urban planning level, apart from the public transit system that we spoke about, more on the personal transport side, and to use the word, it's not about personal transport, the choice that people would make, and if the choice is beyond the bus. Hello, Revati, can you hear us? We probably, can you hear me? Anand, Ashwin?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Revati seems a bit frozen on the image screen. Yeah.
So, I think one last question. I know there's been a bunch of questions from the attendees that you have been already addressing. So maybe, we can take one more question while Revati comes on board. Is, from the view of both of you as entrepreneurs who've been involved with building and starting and building something, what are some of the things that you would pose to the investors today, right? From supporting and building on this whole green transportation network, right? That is needed. There's obviously an opportunity. They see the need. They've been investing for a while, but what more can be done, and what are the questions you'd pose to them? Right,
Alan's dealt with a lot more investors than I have, so.
But you might have better answers, Ashwin, than I do. Yeah. Look, I think that the challenge, in my view, in India's case, is that we need to strive for excellence in an Indian way, right? So my view from the investor perspective is that don't look for copycats that are taking models from elsewhere and figuring out how to bring them into this market. Figure out what the story is for India and help make it happen. Because the sky is very, very blue, and there are very significant opportunities that are natural in the case of India, right? Again, we are going all clean electricity at some point in time, right? We are an oil importer. That's not good for us in the long haul. We tend to be fairly rational as buyers. We're one of the few markets in the world where people buy a vehicle based on how many kmpl it gives. It's an advert, even on the billboard, it says, kitna deta hai, right? And that arguably leans towards, at the tipping point, leans towards rational purchasing when it comes to electrification as well. There are enormous sets of opportunities that exist. And I think the investor plays a very key role in making that happen today. The ones that will get rewarded most are the ones who make the bet on where India can go. And the ones who get rewarded the least are the ones who are waiting for India to prove it can go somewhere before they choose to cut a check.
Right.
So let me add, I was trying to think what I can add to that. There's one thing in particular, and maybe Anand can sort of comment on this too, that I think investors need to understand that clean transportation is a substitution play. And this is an important point. A lot of services exist that are performed today by diesel vehicles and petrol vehicles and so on and so forth. Those vehicles in the future are going to become electric powered vehicles or clean fuel powered vehicles. So the market opportunity for each of these market segments is massive. If you take employee transportation, there are 300,000 vehicles doing that, right? The investors, I think, because investors tend to invest in 20 things, and 19 of those 20 things are not substitution plays. They are about truly grabbing market share from somebody else doing something better than what they are doing. They're not in a transformative thing where whether they succeed or not, the thing that they are trying is going to happen anyway. So think about it. This is an important thing. Investors invest in a company thinking that that company is going to do something. But with electric, we are in a space whether lithium fails or all electric fails is not the issue. India is going to go electric, right? So now you have to understand that this transformation provides a different kind of canvas for action. And this canvas for action, being alert to that, must give investors greater confidence in going down this road, and simply to say, how can I just tick off all the different pieces that I can tick off in this transformation? Because if you start to judge substitution plays the way you judge non-substitution plays, you're actually going to end up with the wrong answer.
Sounds good. And so Revati, I think we lost you for a bit. Can you hear us? Yeah. So we just covered what the entrepreneurs here would ask the investors, because that's also another community in the green transportation sector. And we have about 10 minutes left. So maybe one quick question each of you want to ask the other panelists. You can ask one question, and then there's also some questions around retrofitting that we'll get to towards the end of the conversation. But we have about 10 minutes. So Revati, maybe you want to start with a question you might have for your fellow panelists.
Sure. For both of you, actually, we've been talking a lot about the buses and we've talked about electric cars. Now, is the future for electric buses following the same trajectory, or are we seeing some greater incentive to push that ahead, or is there less incentive? I sort of want to get a comparative sense of how it's looking vis-a-vis the car uptake.
Look,
So,
from my perspective, it's a financing problem. Mm-hmm. Right. An electric bus is significantly more expensive than a diesel bus at the moment. Right. But on an operating cost basis over the life of the bus, it's not. Right. And there needs to be a financial instrument that allows for those buses to be financed over their operating life. The government tried to do some version of this, through this leasing program, effectively where they were allowing financing per kilometer as a purchase. Right. But this is true of many things. It also aligns to the investor conversation. The innovation isn't just product here.
Yes.
Right. The innovation also involves practices, policies, financing models, etc. If you allowed me to cash flow finance something, I could get a lot more out there. Right. And that's a real opportunity. So to me, the bus cost will go down, whether it's electric or it's hydrogen fuel cell or it's anything else. Right? They have abilities to deploy very quickly. You look at CNG buses in Delhi deployed overnight because, they go back to the same depot and you could fill CNG. You didn't have to have, different stands all over the place. The same is true of charging stations. But the problem ends up becoming that in the way that the bus owner buyer operates, they think of it as a capital outlay against a 50 lakh rupee bus versus a 1.5 crore rupee bus, rather than a capital outlay for kilometers delivered.
Right. I think I really, what you've said resonates with me, because this sort of financing issue, which is not just about the money, but about the financial instrument and how that's designed, along with how fair contracts can be set up between the public and private partnerships. I've been talking to bus providers, not electric necessarily, but because it's essentially a non-profit making venture for them, there's a great need to provide that gap funding somewhere and also create the kind of innovative partnership that would make this successful.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid and maybe this is an area that the government can actually invest into today and sort of create that the space for innovators and early adopters to take charge. So, Anand, any questions you have for your fellow panelists?
I'm curious to know what Revati and Ashwin. There were some questions around this as well. But given this COVID situation, right? Do you see any major changes in the way people choose to organize? Like one of the arguments we're making in the U.S. now is that, there's been this mass movement towards urban living, right? Less, living in a smaller space with more services rather than living in a larger space, which was the grand American dream, I guess. And there's some view that might reverse, right? People who are stuck in a box for 8 weeks may think that, look, resilience means something different. Do you see patterns changing related to this over the course of the future?
So can I go first, or yeah?
Please.
Yeah. I think the whole issue of what good density means for city planners has come into a big question. And it's different in different contexts, but how much is too much from the point of view of hygiene, from the point of view of public health? Had we gone overboard? And certainly there are parts of Indian cities where the living conditions are extremely difficult. And we were sort of continuing with this because jobs were attracting people. So I remember this very beautiful quote which Charles Correa made long ago, when he said about Mumbai that Mumbai is a great city, but a terrible place. And I think COVID is going to give us the opportunity to make it a great place as well. Because what he was saying is that the cultural density and the density of talent is brilliant in Mumbai, but it's the physical infrastructure which has been at breaking point for a long time. And it's amazing it's still going on. So to answer your question, are things changing? I think people will think of density in a different way, both authorities and people who can afford to think of it. The other change, which I think is not going to change, is this idea that everyone's going to work from home. I think Ashwin said that as well, that there's a very small proportion that can actually work from home. And even for them, we're seeing from the well-being perspective, from the team energy perspective, it's not necessarily a sustainable view working from home. So this whole idea of this blended, maybe once a week you go to work and 3 times a week you're from home, that I think is going to be a more realistic shift for that particular segment.
Well, I think there's a lot of inertia on them. People are not going to go with. I don't anticipate the behavioral change of the kind that we're looking for is going to happen quickly. But there's also a cost element. People weren't really choosing suburbia over the city center, right? Even when they chose suburbia, they were choosing their neighbors. Right? And that's really all it is. When people buy homes, they choose their neighbors. They're not choosing the neighborhood. They're trying to choose the neighbors, and they incidentally happen to live in certain neighborhoods, and that's why they go looking at those neighborhoods. I don't expect that to change. And especially in India, there's a particular problem. Because of the way there isn't, when cities give out permits to build housing, they don't give out permits in the proportion that is actually needed. They don't say 40% of the permits have to be for low-income housing, 30% for middle income, and maybe only 5.5% for the rich, and so on and so forth. They treat each application as though it just only needs to meet the technical limits of what is permissible in a plot, and after that, pretty much anything can be done. And one of the reasons you've got the situation that you've got today is that a very large part of the land needed for equitable housing has actually been taken by other guys who can afford to pay for it, right? So, and in fact, even land that was needed for social infrastructure like schools and parks and all of that has also been taken by guys who can afford to pay for private housing. So you priced all these public good things out of the market. Now, so unless you make a conscious decision to reverse that price discrimination that exists in the way that now things are, you're not going to be able to change things. but an increasingly large number of homeowners does not want this price discrimination to be reversed. Housing is a peculiar thing. It's the only thing on the planet in which a politician can go and tell his constituents, I'm going to make sure this thing costs more in the future, and people will vote for you on that basis. Right? Almost anything else, if you go around saying, I'm going to make sure this thing costs more, they'll kick you out of office. But with housing, people who own homes want the prices of their homes to go up. There's a fundamental disconnect between what's good from a personal asset point of view and what's actually good for the city and its people. And until we break that, I don't see how we can reverse any of the choices that people have made.
Right, and so clearly, I think also for the audience, there's a very strong correlation with where people live and how people live with the transportation, and therefore you're seeing a lot of the discussions also go back and forth between transportation and the housing and the footpaths and so on, right? So just for the audience to think all of that. And I think we have just 1 minute. So Ashwin, I think we'll have to take away your chance to ask the question. We'll probably make sure the panelists will answer it offline. But excellent discussion, I think, on the fact that you need to think about mobility holistically. You need to think about what is in the public space, how more buses and more non-motorized transportation can come in. As well as the financing aspect, and the adoption is not necessarily economically less viable right now, but it's a question of both will and interest, and possibly the first set of innovators and adopters going out there and making it happen. So excellent. Thank you so much, everybody. I wish we could talk more. This is a topic that actually, as you can see, weaves between livelihoods and living spaces and getting from one place to the other. So it lives in a continuum, but we are out of time right now, and I'll hand over to Gaurav. Gaurav, I can see you. Great. Thank you for the opportunity for all of us as well to participate in this.
Thanks, everyone. I really didn't want to cut that any short, but we did have a few quick announcements and to wrap up, because this is the last session of the energy vertical. And I just want to say it was a great last session, because it brings to a close what I think is, we tried to put a journey together over the last 2 days to say that, well, look, energy is one of those things where, it's a constant. So it's not one of the fundamental things where you're expecting demand to change, right? What's changing though is people's behaviors. And I think what we saw over the last set of panels is that people are just having very different conversations with an underlying energy demand that's going to keep going up. So I just wanted to quickly recap that and then make an important announcement for the sort of the next plenary that's coming up, right? On renewables, which is where we started on our first day, that demand is going to be shooting through the roof. Renewables is a place that has already proven in its finances, right? And it's also proven, obviously, on the sustainability side. The next battleground for renewables is going to be about jobs and make in India, right? That's going to become one of the big flashpoints as you go through a post-COVID recovery. And that's some of the things that people talked about. And within renewables, decentralized is going to become incredibly important. It's always been the sort of just small, energy access child. But as you see huge migration and some of the trends that these panelists just talked about in terms of people moving away from cities and so forth, decentralized energy just offers another interesting business model, and also has a lot of play for green transport. Cooking, again, an incredibly important part of the energy mix, where in India you have this huge opportunity around indoor air pollution, which is killing way more people than even some of the worst estimates on COVID. And that there's a new conversation around that, because people are having a conversation about health. They're having a conversation about air pollution. Even the government relief efforts have really pushed the ability for people to be getting gas. Many people are getting gas for the first time. So there's been a really interesting opportunity on clean cooking. And then, of course, all of this is changing our communication. Clean energy as a concept, as a thing that actually the common person is interested in, rather than a developer, is something that we, on our communications panel, we were actually seeing that there's just greater interest. And then finally, I think with green transport, you guys talked about many new conversations that are happening, which are not just about electric, but actually reimagining what cities will actually look like. And then therefore, what is green transport really about? And so I think that was a quick fire way of saying, thank you, and just summarizing all of the panels. And I just want to tell the audience that thanks for joining us. We had a great turnout throughout the 2 days, but also please now make your way to the plenary session where we have some fantastic speakers. We're just putting them up, and it's a plenary session for nonprofits, by nonprofits. So you've got Safina, Madhav Chavan, Sridhar Venkat, Ujjwal Thakkar, Matthew Spacey, some of the real stalwarts of the NGO space. And I think this will be a really exciting conversation. So thank you again, and we'll see you at the plenary. And thanks again to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Gav.
Thank you.